Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute. All right. Good morning, everyone. We are going to reconvene the Mid-Atlantic Council's April 2026 meeting. We're going to be starting off today with a presentation from Hayden on staff, and at some point we will be kicking it over to Garfo as well to talk about the SCUP Winter 1 quota period landings, and Hayden will get us started with the threshold analysis. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Excuse me. All right, good morning, everyone. First up on the agenda, we have the SCUP Winter 1 landings threshold analysis. So this is just a rough outline of everything we're going to walk through in this presentation. First, we'll go over some regulatory background for the SCUP commercial quota periods, including Winter 1. Then we'll review some recent advisory panel and monitoring and technical committee input that was received last June. Then we'll walk through the analysis, which includes an overview of Winter 1 fishery performance in the past and in recent years, as well as the landings threshold analysis and what that means should become clearer as we get into the presentation. Then we'll review some public comments that were received leading up to this meeting, and then we'll get into the staff recommendation and potential next steps. And the Council's objective for today's meeting is to consider initiating a framework action. SCUP was added to the Summer Flounder Fishery Management Plan in 1995 through a joint action by the Council and Commission, which approved Amendment 8. The amendment established various management measures for the commercial and recreational SCUP fisheries to achieve rebuilding of the stock, including a coastwide commercial quota applicable in state and federal waters. The amendment also required that the Council and Commission develop a system that would be used to allocate the quota in year 2 of the management program, beginning January 1st, 1997. Amendment 8 was submitted to the National Marine Fisheries Service before the system was refined so that regulations could be implemented as soon as possible. Under the Amendment 8 regulations, the commercial quota system was allowed to operate without restrictions to control the rate of harvest. So, for example, any trip limits or seasonal allocations. Without specific restrictions, there was concern that the seasonal nature of the fishery, paired with differences in vessel size, could lead to uneven access to the quota, with larger vessels fishing offshore in the winter accessing the quota sooner than smaller vessels fishing inshore in the summer. Through a 1996 regulatory amendment, the Council and Commission developed a seasonal quota system to allow for a more equitable distribution of the quota to the commercial sector. In this system, the total annual quota is allocated into 3 periods. Winter 1, which runs through January to April. Summer, which is May through September. And Winter 2, which is October through December. And the percentages you see there are the percent of the total quota allocated to each of these periods each year. These percentages were chosen based on the average proportion of landings attributed to each period from 1983 to 1992. And I'll note that this table reflects the current regulations, so there are some changes to the commercial quota period system that I'll summarize in just a moment. During the winter periods, a coastside quota and possession limits are in effect, whereas in the summer period, quota is allocated and managed on a state-by-state basis. The commercial fishery is closed when the allocation for a period is reached. During the Winter 1 period, which is January through April, the initial possession limit is reduced when a specified percentage of the quota is attained for that period. There's also a provision allowing unused Winter 1 quota to be rolled over into Winter 2, and the Winter 2 possession limit increases based on the amount of quota transferred. Under current regulations, the Winter 1 possession limit starts at 50,000 pounds and is reduced to 1,000 pounds once 80% of the Winter 1 quota is landed. Winter 2 begins with a 12,000 pound possession limit, which may increase if unused Winter 1 quota is rolled over. The winter one trip limit, the threshold triggering a winter one trip limit reduction, the reduced winter one trip limit, and the winter two trip limit can be modified through specifications, and this table summarizes changes to these measures since 1998. Highlighted cells indicate the most recent change to each value. The reduced winter one trip limit is not included in this table since it has been set at 1,000 pounds since the original implementation of the commercial quota periods. The final rule implementing the commercial quota period system became effective on May 20th, 1997, so the winter one fishery that year had already occurred. The system was implemented for the rest of 1997, but 1998 marks the first full year of implementation, so that's what's included here. As you can see, the winter trip limits have been adjusted multiple times in the past, but the most recent changes to the trip limits took place in 2012 and 2014. The council approved a winter one trip limit of 50,000 pounds starting in 2012 to allow for flexibility in business operations, expecting that an increased limit would not cause the winter one quota to be exceeded. And for 2014, the council approved an increased winter two trip limit of 12,000 pounds, up from 2,000 pounds, to allow for greater utilization of the winter two quota. Finally, the percentage threshold triggering a winter one trip limit reduction has remained unchanged since 2002, and I couldn't find a record of the exact rationale for that change. We just walked through the measures that can be modified through specifications, but the regulations outlining the structure of the commercial quota periods have been modified through framework actions in the past. Starting in 2003, Framework 3 allowed the rollover of unused quota from winter 1 to winter 2, and it also modified the quota counting procedure for the summer period. Specifically, it created a mechanism for years when the winter 1 fishery is closed prior to April 15th to allow for commercial landings of scup by state-only permitted vessels that occur between April 15th through April 30th to be counted against the state's summer quota allocation. States have to provide written requests to use this mechanism. Also, starting in 2018, Framework 12 modified the dates of the quota periods, moving the month of October from the summer period to winter 2. Stakeholders stated that the more restrictive possession limits during the summer period had prevented fishermen from landing high volumes of scup when they're available, so the intent of moving October from the summer period to winter 2 was to address the issue of foregone yield. Before we get into topics that are more specific to winter 1, I just wanted to offer up this table in case folks had questions about fishery performance across all of the quota periods in recent years. This table breaks down landings into each of the 3 quota periods from 2021 to 2026, comparing landings to each period's quota allocation. This data was sourced from the CAMS database accessed on March 31st of this year. You'll notice that revised winter 2 quota is listed here because in each year leading up to 2026, some amount of unused winter 1 quota was rolled over into winter 2, increasing that period's allocation. With the exception of 2026, there have been consistent quota underages for each of the quota periods in recent years, and preliminary 2026 data indicate that a 22% overage of the winter 1 quota occurred. So let's move on to some recent advisory panel and monitoring and technical committee input. And I want to preface this by saying that the context in which the input was received was pretty different from this year because it was back in June of 2025. So last June, GARFO staff recommended some changes to the winter 1 regulations that the council will discuss today. Before I get into what those recommendations are, I think it's important to cover how those recommendations arose in the first place because historically, the winter 1 trip limit reduction has not been used in recent years. Last year, the winter 1 quota was 8.81 million pounds, and current data shows that the 80% threshold was reached on April 24th. Ultimately, 88% of the quota was landed by the end of the period, so why wasn't the trip limit reduction implemented? During the winter 1 period, GARFO tracks landings against quota as the data rolls in. VTR data must be submitted within 48 hours of a trip occurring, but dealer data are due the Tuesday after scup have been landed for sale. This means that every week our picture of landings is slightly off due to lags in data availability. According to GARFO staff, projections indicated that the 80% threshold would be reached in the last week of winter 1 in 2025. However, the agency has to wait until actual landings data show that the threshold has been met before initiating an in-season adjustment. So while GARFO staff expected the threshold to be met and action could not be taken, the implementation window was constrained by lags in data availability, and on top of that, the agency requires at least a week to implement an in-season adjustment, so there was not enough time remaining in the period for the adjustment to be implemented anyway. So to reiterate that last point, the threshold was met on April 24th, so only 6 days remained in the period. So even if the agency had access to perfectly real-time data, there was likely not enough time in the period to implement the reduction anyway. The agency is limited in how they implement the trip limit reduction due to how current regulations are phrased. Regulations specify that the monitoring committee will recommend to the council and commission through the specifications process that the percent of landings attained at which the landing limit for the winter one period will be reduced. This implies rather than a projection. You'll also notice that the provision states the landing limit for the winter one period will be reduced. This means that the trip limit reduction is not discretionary. In a year like 2025, when there are a few days left over to harvest the remaining 20% of quota, it may make sense not to implement the reduction because harvest opportunities can be preserved without risking a quota overage. However, if landings accrue more rapidly than expected, as was observed this year, the trip limit reduction could be a crucial measure to prevent an overage. With how the regulations are currently written, NMFS does not have the flexibility to forego the trip limit reduction when an overage is unlikely, nor to implement it proactively based on projections when the provision may be necessary to prevent an overage. GARFO staff provided 2 recommendations designed to give the agency greater flexibility in when and whether the winter one trip limit reduction is implemented. First, they suggested that the council consider allowing the National Marine Fisheries Service to implement the reduction when the threshold is projected to be reached. And they also suggested that the council consider making the trip limit reduction discretionary. A framework action would be required to build more flexibility into the winter one trip limit regulations. These recommendations were presented to the advisory panel and the monitoring and technical committee last summer, so I'll briefly review the input they had at the time. In June 2025, council staff presented the regulatory changes proposed by GARFO for the advisory panel's consideration, referring to the winter one trip limit reduction. One advisor commented that if implemented as written, fishermen would likely not go offshore for 1,000 pounds of scub. Advisors also offered 3 recommendations separate from those recommended by GARFO. They suggested increasing the 80% threshold, increasing the 1,000-pound reduced possession limit, and removing the possession limit reduction altogether. Overall, the rationale for these proposals is to allow for more of the winter one quota to be landed. The percentage threshold and reduced possession limit can be modified through specifications, and removing the provision altogether would require a framework action. Staff presented the changes suggested by GARFO and advisors to the monitoring and technical committees in July 2025. At this time, that body recommended no changes to the commercial management measures that can be modified through specifications, including the winter one possession limits for 2026 and 2027. Given the winter one regulations have not been reviewed in recent years, staff recommended that a review of the possession limit and percentage threshold values be added to the 2026 implementation plan, and the monitoring and technical committee agreed with this recommendation. One monitoring committee member asked how the fishery responded to implementation of the winter one trip limit reduction in past years, and we'll review this on a later slide. Before we move on to the analysis portion of the presentation, I wanted to take a moment to summarize the changes proposed by GARFO staff and advisors last June and reiterate what changes can be made through specifications versus a framework action. The winter one trip limits, including the starting and reduced trip limit and the percentage threshold triggering a reduction, can be modified through specifications. And the regulatory language implementing the winter one trip limit reduction can be modified through a framework action. All right, and before we walk through what transpired this year, I'm going to provide a little more context on how the winter one fisheries performed in recent years. In recent years, the commercial scub fishery has underutilized both the annual quota and the winter one quota allocation, and the overall quota and winter one allocation have fluctuated. You can see that in 2023, the commercial quota decreases notably to the lowest level in this time series. Prior to 2023, the 78% of the ABC was allocated to the commercial fishery, and starting in 2023, this allocation decreased to 65%. The commercial quota increased again in 2024 and has decreased each year since. This year, preliminary data show that there was a winter one quota overage of 22%. The winter one trip limit reduction was not implemented, and the fishery was closed on March 16th. We'll get into the details of how this occurred in a few slides, but I first want to take a step back to see how the trip limit reduction has functioned in the past. So the winter one trip limit reduction was last implemented in 2008, 2009, and 2010. At the time, this resulted in minor winter one underages ranging from less than 1% to 4%, and remaining quota in the winter one period was rolled over into winter two, and that remaining amount ranged from about 15,000 pounds to 97,000 pounds. And because the amount rolled over was less than 500,000 pounds, the winter two trip limit remained at 2,000 pounds. And at this time, the regional administrator used projections to implement the trip limit reduction in all three of those years, as well as winter two closures in 2008 and 2009. Regulations specify that the percent of landings attained at which, oh, sorry, I lost my place here. So regulations specify that the trip limit reduction will be implemented once landings attain the specified percentage threshold. So this use of projections to implement the trip limit reduction was actually misaligned with the regulations. And interestingly, the wording of the regulations is actually inconsistent. The regulations also specify that the regional administrator shall determine the date when the commercial quota for a period will be harvested. So that implies that projections could be used to implement a commercial fishery closure. One of GARFO's recommendations that we reviewed earlier would modify that first provision, bringing these two regulations into alignment. Next, we'll move on to more recent winter one fishery performance. This may feel like a jump, but the winter one trip limit reduction has not been implemented since 2010, and the provision has become more relevant this year. For this portion of the analysis, I pulled daily landings data, or GARFO staff pulled daily landings data for the winter one quota period from 2021 to 2026, and the goal is to characterize the timing constraints of implementing the trip limit reduction, especially for 2026. This chart shows coastwide commercial scup landings in millions of pounds aggregated weekly during the winter one quota period in 2021. Data was aggregated this way to preserve data confidentiality, and no confidential data are included. I prepared a similar chart for each year through 2026, and I'll flip through these pretty quickly for time's sake, but the point here is to get a qualitative sense of the landing trajectory in each year and to see when the 80% threshold has been reached. And I have a summary table at the end of these graphs that compares these charts more quantitatively. The black line represents cumulative coastwide landings in the winter one period. The solid red line marks the winter one quota, and the dotted red line marks the 80% quota threshold. The final landings for the quota period are in the black text box in the upper right-hand corner. So here you can see that landings are spread evenly throughout the period, and the 80% threshold was not reached. And total landings for this winter one fishery period amounted to 5.85 million pounds. The landing trajectory for 2022 looks pretty similar to 2021, and the quota is slightly smaller at 9.19 million pounds. And once again, the 80% threshold was not reached. 2023 is the first year in this time series where the 80% threshold is exceeded. The date the 80% threshold was exceeded is indicated by the text in the red box with the red arrow. And since landings are aggregated weekly, the date doesn't align perfectly with a data marker on the landings line. This trajectory appears only slightly steeper than the previous year, and the quota is much lower at 6.32 million pounds. The 80% threshold is exceeded on April 13th, and ultimately 92% of the winter one quota was landed, and a trip limit reduction was not implemented. In 2024, the quota is notably higher at 9.54 million pounds. The landing trajectory seems to have shifted upward, and landings are evenly spread throughout the period. The 80% threshold was exceeded on April 24th, and ultimately 82% of the quota was landed. And once again, the trip limit reduction was not implemented. We've already seen this chart, but just to go over it briefly, the 2025 winter one quota is lower compared to 2024, and landings appear to be spread evenly throughout the period. As with the previous year, the 80% threshold was exceeded on April 24th, and ultimately 88% of the quota was landed, and the trip limit reduction was not implemented. In 2026, the landing trajectory looks drastically different from prior years. The beginning of the line seems to have a similar slope, and then landings accrue relatively rapidly starting in early February. The 80% threshold was exceeded on April 21st, 62 days earlier than in 2024 and 2025. The trip limit reduction was not implemented, and the fishery closed on March 16th. And like I stated before, 2026 landings data are still preliminary, so final accounting could differ, but based on this data, landings exceeded the winter one quota by 22%. This table summarizes some of the data visualized in those graphs. I included average weekly landings and maximum weekly landings to highlight the relative pace of harvest each year. And there's a gradual increase in average and maximum landings until 2025. But then there's a sharp increase in these values from 2025 to 2026. From 2025 to 2026, the average weekly landings increased by 88%, and the 80% threshold was reached 62 days earlier than in 2024 and 2025. And the next part of this analysis may provide an explanation behind this drastic change. So the landings threshold analysis is based on past analyses that have informed the winter one trip limits. And for this, I took coastwide SCUP landings, including landings by federal and state permitted vessels. Garfo staff accessed the CAMS database and provided tables for each year from 2021 to 2026. And I think it's easier to actually look at the table to explain what this means. So this table's a lot to take in. So let's just start by looking at the very first row under the column titles. The threshold of greater than or equal to 1 means that any trip landing at least 1 pound of SCUP is included in this top row. So this row summarizes the total number of vessels, trips, and landings occurring in the 2026 winter one fishery. As we move down the table, the thresholds increase. And since we start at trips landing at least 1 pound of SCUP, all of the higher thresholds are subsets of that category. For example, 131 vessels landed at least 1 pound of SCUP, but only 99 vessels landed at least 500 pounds of SCUP, and so on. And the percentages indicate the relative proportion of each value to the total. So returning to the uppermost row, the percentage next to 131 vessels is 100%, because that represents the total number of vessels, and moving down the column, the percentages decrease since you're looking at smaller subsets of the fleet. So looking at the 50,000 pound category, 22 vessels landed at that limit, representing 17% of the total number of vessels for this year. A similar table was produced for the winter one fishery for each year since 2021. And if you look through those tables, which are included in the supplemental staff memo, since that data was corrected, you'll notice an increasing trend in the number of vessels landing at higher thresholds and the number of trips at those higher thresholds. Rather than flip through each of the tables, I thought it would be more helpful to view recent trends in higher volume landings in graph form. And if the council would be interested in viewing the individual tables or a summary table with average values for the last 5 years, I have those in my backup slides. This graph displays the total number of vessels, trips, and associated landings for trips landing at least 30,000 pounds of SCUP. The vertical axis on the left applies to the vessel and trip counts, and the decimals on the right-hand side represent commercial SCUP landings in millions of pounds. Over this time series, vessels landing at least 30,000 pounds increased from 13 in 2021 to 33 in 2026. Trips landing at this threshold increased from 36 to 97, and the associated landings also follow that trajectory, increasing from 1.45 million pounds in 2021 to 4.21 million pounds in 2026. Now let's compare the average values for 21 to 2025 to 2026. So these tables, if you look at the top table, those are the average values for trips landing at 30,000, 40,000, and 50,000 pounds over the last 5 years. And then if you look at the table below that, that is just the table for 2026. In 2026, 33 vessels completed 160 trips at 30,000 pounds, representing increases of 57% and 151% from the 2021 to 2025 averages, respectively. There's also a notable increase in the amount of landings associated with this threshold of 176%. Now, I created a similar graph for trips landing at 50,000 pounds. 2025 is excluded from this graph given the values are confidential. Over this time series, vessels landing at least 50,000 pounds increased from 3 in 2021 to 2020. Sorry, I'm mixing up my numbers here. Vessels landing at least 50,000 pounds increased from 3 vessels in 2021 to 22 vessels in 2026. Trips landing at this threshold increased from 4 to 19, and the associated landings also follow that trajectory, increasing from about 200,000 pounds in 2021 to 2.74 million pounds in 2026. So again, let's compare the 21 to 2025 averages to the 2026 values. In 2026, 22 vessels completed 53 trips, each landing at least 50,000 pounds, representing increases of 389% and 542% respectively, relative to the 2021 to 2024 averages. There's also a notable increase in the amount of landings associated with this threshold. So this is just a slide summarizing some of the results that we walked through, because I know that was kind of a lot. Data show an increase in average weekly landings from 2025 to 2026, an increase of 88%. There's also been a gradual increase in total trips occurring at higher volumes over the last 5 years, but this pattern accelerated in 2026. Notably, there was more than a 300% and 500% increase in the number of vessels and trips landing at 50,000 pounds compared to the 2021 to 2024 average. This coincided with earlier attainment of the Winter One quota in 2026 compared to recent years and a subsequent closure. So, thinking back to those recommendations that advisors made in June of 2025, these recommendations were intended to allow for greater utilization of the Winter One quota, but the trip limit reduction has not been constraining harvests in recent years since it hasn't been implemented. Other factors like market dynamics may have a larger influence on scup harvest. 2026 demonstrates an unprecedented situation where implementation of the trip limit reduction could have prevented an overage and preserved harvest opportunities throughout the rest of the period. So just to walk through these recommendations, let's say the percentage threshold triggering a trip limit reduction is increased to 90%. This would further constrain the implementation window because the threshold would be reached later in the period. Increasing the 1,000-pound reduced possession limit is a moot point unless barriers to implementing the trip limit reduction are addressed. And removing the possession limit reduction altogether could allow what happened this year to occur again in the future, where landings accrue rapidly, so much so that the trip limit reduction cannot be implemented and the fishery has to be closed early. The original intent of the quota periods was to allow for a more equitable distribution of the quota to the commercial sector, and the proposed changes shown on this slide would do nothing to promote successful implementation of the reduction, a tool that could be used to preserve harvest opportunities for larger and smaller vessels in similar situations. Okay, so the next portion of this presentation will summarize some public comments that were received leading up to this meeting. And I want to note that there are actually 13 comments in total in the portal, but some of them were received as late as yesterday, so I just did not have time to summarize them for this presentation, but you are going to get a summary of 8 of them. So starting with the first row here, 3 commenters supported reducing the initial Winter One trip limit, generally speaking, and as a reminder, that's currently set at 50,000 pounds. And 2 of those commenters elaborated on potential options for reducing the 50,000 pound trip limit. One individual suggested reducing it to 30,000 pounds or making the current 50,000 pound trip limit bi-weekly. And another commenter suggested reducing it to 20,000 pounds. And then overall, 4 commenters expressed opposition to reducing the initial Winter One trip limit. Now, getting into some comments that relate to the percentage threshold and the reduced possession limit, 3 commenters supported reducing the percentage threshold triggering a trip limit reduction, generally speaking, and 2 offered some elaboration on potential changes to those measures. 1 commenter suggested reducing the threshold from 80 to 75% and implementing a reduced initial trip limit of 20,000 pounds. And another commenter suggested reducing the threshold to 50% and implementing a system of tiered trip limit reduction. And no commenters expressed opposition to reducing the percentage threshold or increasing the reduced possession limit. We also got some comments that had to do with reporting and monitoring requirements and some other suggestions. So in total, 3 commenters supported enhanced reporting requirements, generally speaking. One commenter specifically suggested implementing same-day dockside monitoring for processing facilities where necessary. And another commenter suggested implementing some sort of pre-landing notification requirement via VMS or an IVR system. One commenter opposed enhanced reporting requirements, and 2 commenters supported the National Marine Fisheries Service monitoring quota more closely without offering specific recommendations for how to do so. And here we're going to get into some of the rationale behind some of these recommendations. So 2 commenters stated that limited opportunities in other fisheries, including herring, mackerel, squid, and scallops, and increased processing capacity for the frozen market led to increased targeting of scup. So it's kind of the perfect storm to increase harvest this year. 2 commenters expressed concern regarding fair and equitable access to the winter one fishery, noting that larger vessels caught most of the quota early on, limiting access for small historic businesses. One commenter highlighted lost income due to the early closure and noted that losses for some small ports and vessels would be greater if the fishery closed when it was supposed to, which would have been the 3rd week of February. And 2 commenters stated that in New Jersey, followed by Rhode Island, harvested the majority of the 2026 winter one quota. 2 commenters stated that the 50,000-pound trip limit is important to maintain the frozen market. One commenter noted that this is especially important due to rising fuel costs, and this commenter also stated that reducing the trip limit may make the frozen market non-viable, flooding the fresh market with fish and possibly increasing regulatory discards. One commenter suggested increasing the annual scup quota to about 20 million pounds and setting aside a piece of quota for bycatch with a 5,000-pound trip limit. The same commenter suggested a tiered winter one trip limit reduction system. So for example, starting with an initial trip limit of 50,000 pounds, they suggested that once 50% of the quota is landed, reducing that to 25,000 pounds. Once 75% of the quota is landed, reduce the trip limit to 10,000 pounds. And once 85% of the quota is landed, reduce the trip limit to 5,000 pounds. So this slide is just a summary of all of the suggestions received through public comments. Some commenters suggested mitigating the risk of a future winter one overage through modifications to the winter one trip limits and percentage threshold, and some were more in favor of enhanced reporting or monitoring requirements. All right, and this is the final portion of the presentation. Thank you for sticking with me. So council staff have identified 2 potential approaches for ensuring more equitable access to the winter one quota and mitigating the risk of future winter one overages. First, option A would be to lower the 80% threshold and increase the 1,000-pound reduced possession limit for 2027 through specifications. And then option B would be to initiate a framework action to revise the winter one trip limit regulations and increase the 1,000-pound reduced possession limit for 2027 through specifications. And council staff recommend option B. So option A would involve changes through specifications, and this approach would alleviate the time constraint associated with the threshold being met late in the season. And assuming this is enough to ensure implementation of the trip limit reduction when needed, increasing the 1,000-pound reduced possession limit could enhance access to the remaining quota throughout the rest of the period. However, one gap that staff have identified with this option is that this approach would not mitigate a potential scenario when landings accrue rapidly, as observed this year, because data lags would persist, delaying the agency's in-season response and increasing the likelihood of a winter one quota overage. And this could work against the original intent of the quota periods, which is to allow for a more equitable distribution of the quota to the commercial sector. And like I said before, modifications to the threshold and/or trip limits would be considered through specifications. And what this would look like is we'll have advisory panel and monitoring and technical committee meetings in June of this year, and the council will deliberate potential changes to the specifications in August of this year. So this isn't something that would have to be decided upon today because there's a process to go through later this year. Through option B, the council would consider building management flexibility into the Winter 1 trip limit regulations, specifically the language preventing GARFO from using projected landings to implement a trip limit reduction. And GARFO could be provided discretionary authority to not implement the trip limit reduction if an overage seems unlikely. Unlike option A, this approach would address the underlying constraint that prevented a timely response to the rapid pace of landings this year. This would support more equitable access to the Winter 1 quota by tempering the pace of landings, preserving harvest opportunities throughout the rest of the period. So in sum, this approach would allow GARFO flexibility to implement the Winter 1 trip limit reduction in a timely manner when needed. Draft alternatives could be considered through a potential framework action, and increasing the 1,000-pound reduced possession limit would be addressed through specifications. Staff have put together this potential range of draft alternatives, and this was provided in the original staff memo. And the council, of course, would not have to decide on this today, but this is just offered for some preliminary consideration, and this would be refined through the development of a framework action if a framework action is initiated. So another piece of consideration for option B is the timeline for potential framework action. This would depend on the involvement of the commission and other council priorities. The table on this slide shows potential framework action timelines, and highlighted cells indicate meetings where the council could convene with the commission, Summer Flounder Scup, and Black Sea Bass Management Board in person. So you can see that under the delayed timeline, the council and commission would meet in August 2026 with final action in December of 2026. And the implication there is that if final action is taken in December, I think it would be unlikely that any regulatory changes would be implemented in time for the 2027 Winter 1 fishery. And then under the expedited timeline, if meetings were held in June of this year and August of this year, I think that would it'd be much more likely that the regulations could be implemented in time for the 2027 Winter 1 fishery. So I know this slide has a lot of text, but one consideration for the potential changes offered under option B is that multiple other fisheries in the Mid-Atlantic region already have regulations that allow the regional administrator to implement commercial fishery closures and trip limit reductions based on projected landings. And I won't read through this entire list, but this list just includes other fisheries managed by the Mid-Atlantic Council. So there is some precedent here. And another consideration for considering changes to the Winter 1 regulations is that over the next 2 years, the commercial scup quota and the Winter 1 allocation are scheduled to decrease by 20% between 2025 and 2027. So this could lead to earlier attainment of the 80% threshold, especially given the requirement that Winter 1 landing overages must be deducted from the subsequent year's Winter 1 allocation. And I'll note that the magnitude of the required payback is unknown, given that 2026 data are still preliminary and could change due to late data reports and data corrections. And 2 states have applied to have their Winter 1 landings after April 15th count against their summer allocations. So there are 2 main decision points for today's meeting. First, the council will consider initiating a potential framework action. And if a framework action is initiated, direct staff regarding the desired timeline and development of draft alternatives. And of course, the council can provide preliminary input on changes to the Winter 1 percentage threshold and trip limits, but those measures will be considered through the specification process that will commence this summer. So that is all I have for today's presentation, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Hayden. Appreciate that. And I'm not sure we could have handled any more than that. So a lot to discuss, but I certainly want to get started with questions on what we've seen so far. as I mentioned, you know, I think Garfo does want to speak to this at some point as well. So, Mike, you know, if you want to let us get through a round of questions first, we could do that. So I'll look to the council, and then just to let everyone know, I'll also give the public a chance to ask questions first. We can get into public comment later. So to the council, looking for hands. I see around the room. Chris Bat Savage, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation, Hayden. Hayden, did I hear you correctly that the winter one overage will need to be paid back in a subsequent year, even if the total annual quota isn't exceeded?
Yeah, so it's my understanding that landings overages will be deducted pound for pound from the next year's winter one quota allocation.
Michelle Duval.
So following up on Chris's question, if we were to initiate a framework action, would that pound for pound deduction be something that we could address within that framework action as well? In other words, if the total quota was not exceeded, you know, could we modify that provision?
Same question I had. Perhaps we can turn that to the regional administrator for his thoughts.
Yeah, we've been starting to talk about this. I think if the council initiates a framework adjustment, then that's on the table. I think changing the accountability measures to allow us to do a full year assessment of whether the commercial quota was exceeded before requiring a pound for pound payback would be an option in a framework adjustment.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Michelle, for the question. Lori Nolan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Another question for Mike, not to put him on the spot. I'm just wondering if we had already had in place an ability for the service to close the fishery based on projections, do you see that what just happened would have happened? Could it have been prevented if you had had that ability to do that this year?
It absolutely would have happened, but it would have been potentially mitigated. And in my presentation, which I'll give in a few minutes, I can try to explain why, but it would help. And so I think, and what I'm going to speak to in a few minutes is that there sort of was a perfect storm of circumstances this year that combined to put us in the situation that we're in. And so there are a number of things that we can do to mitigate those, the combination of which I think would allow us to avoid the situation that we had this year.
Follow up, Lori.
Please, thank you. So hearing the perfect storm, I think, is the exact way to describe what happened this winter. It was all highlighted: no Lalago, no fluke price, no trip limits for mackerel. All these things basically perhaps adjusted effort into the scup fishery this year that we may not have seen had all those things not fallen into place the way they did. The market that was developed, I mean, a great thing, right? We've never seen winter one get harvested. So isn't that our goal, is to harvest our allocations? That having happened created a great marketplace, a great outlet, a great opportunity for industry to go to work and make some money. So I just feel like while the sky is falling in some eyes, maybe it's not as bad as it looks. Had the regional administrator had that ability to close the fishery, opportunity would still be existing, maybe at a lower trip limit. But I just feel like I'm very happy to hear that you may have had a better ability to shut the fishery down had you had that. And the framework, I'm very glad, is on the table to discuss.
Yeah. Michelle, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, more of a process thing. And so, obviously this is part of our 2026 implementation plan, the analysis that Hayden presented and everything. And so I'm trying to recall when we put this into the implementation plan, it says, and consider initiating a management action. So did we build in the time that would be necessary for that management action when we, put this into our implementation plan? I guess I'm looking at Dr. Moore as we say that, so.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Michelle, for the question. So you're right. And if you look at the language in the 2026 implementation plan, it says basically what we're doing today, right? Present an analysis. I think it was paid in a white paper. Is that how it was described? Or consider an action in a white paper? But yeah, I think in terms of the actual question, do we now have time to actually do a framework? As long as the framework is small, yes. If it starts getting crazy and we start adding multiple things, no. So that's pretty much the bottom line. Thanks.
Okay, I do want to get through questions. Again, we can save comments, and we also do have some slides from the RA to talk about, I believe, just the most recent stuff in 2026. But I'll start going down the other side of the table. Joe Grist?
I think Dr. Moore just answered my question. I'm trying to see where's our limitations, because I see this as definitely needing to be expedited so we can get this done. So I think you've kind of hit that. I'm very curious to hear what the regional administrator's presentation shows us before we get to what that's going to look like.
Mike Louisi?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excuse me. So Hayden, I may have missed it in the presentation. So the way I see this, we have a winter one fishery that it's a derby style fishery that we're trying to, the goal is to keep the fishery open and operating throughout the season. And the other goal is to get as close to the target line as possible without going over. And it sounds easy, right? If you have all the information in front of you at any given moment in any given day. But the objectives are incredibly challenging from somebody who has had many experiences managing, in my own state, derby style fishing and trying to close things at the right and the appropriate time. It's really hard. The question that I have for you is, has there been an example in the recent past where we've seen the whole thing play out, where we hit the threshold, an implementation of a lower catch limit went into effect, and then the rest of the season played out under a low catch limit? I don't know that I saw an example where the regional administrator reduced the limit and then the season played out. The examples that I saw looked like the fishery got itself so close to the end of the season that even when the RA would be in a position to close the fishery, they left it open because there were 6 days left or 5 days left in the season. So has the entire process ever played out fully that you're aware of?
Yeah, so earlier on in the presentation, I know there was a lot in there. I do have a slide on past implementation. The last time, and I think the only times the triple limit reduction has been implemented was in 2008, 2009, and 2010. And in each of those years when the triple limit was reduced, by the end of the winter one fishery, there were minor underages of between less than 1% and 4%. So that's, like, to my knowledge, the last time that this whole process has ever played out.
Yeah, that's a good question, Mike, but I think those were, under different trip limits than we're doing now. So, yeah. Tony Kearns?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Hayden, for the presentation. I just want to clarify for the 2B option that would be a framework. It's just making adjustments to what you do via regulation, not making overhaul changes to the FMP itself, right?
Exactly, yeah.
And if that's the case, and we don't add anything about rollovers and such that was just brought up. I don't believe that the commission would need to do an addendum because we don't take part of that regulation process. It's the FMP that I would worry about. So just putting that out there.
Thanks, Tony. I'm not sure if I missed any hands around the table, and I don't see any online, but Rich Wong?
I was just going to say that the projection, the use of projection as a tool is really very effective, and at least in our experience in managing state quotas in Delaware, that tool in itself is all the regional administrator would need. That the trip limit reductions and the thresholds are become really not nearly as important if the regional administrator just simply has the projection tool. Because, when we have state quotas, we'll know when you see the graphs of the daily harvest and the weekly harvest. It's very, very predictable. So that's all I'm saying. Thank you.
Okay. Go ahead, Sonny.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just wondering, there was a lot of boats fishing for scup this year. The number of boats have drastically increased. Could you explain why there was so many more boats this year? Scup fishing?
Yeah, I don't know if Hayden, if you've had any information, heard anything this year. It is something that we can look around the table for folks in industry, or even if a member of the public had some hands there. But I thought that I saw in the presentation that it wasn't necessarily the number of the boats that changed as much as the number of trips. Is that right?
Yeah, so based on the data, it's not that the actual number of vessels increased. In fact, actually, since 2021, the total number of vessels participating in the winter one fishery has decreased over time. It's more so the number of trips at higher volumes has gone up. And based on conversations that I've had with industry members, it seems like just limited opportunities in other fisheries drove some folks to target scup more heavily. And then there was also market demand in Europe. And so I think that there was some increased targeting of scup to go into the frozen market, is my understanding.
Okay, thank you. I think that covered Sonny's question. Jim Gilmore?
So I'm a little confused right now because that last comment seemed to be different from, and I think it was characterized as the perfect storm. I said, look, the issue of the squid, mackerel, and fluke fisheries essentially being not available was really the primary reason for this. And that kind of gets at this, is that what's the likelihood of that happening again? And if that's very unlikely, then we may take a different road versus something that if we think is going to happen again. So anyway, that's, again, that last comment seemed to contradict that whole perfect storm scenario. Thank you.
All right, so let's do this then, Jim. Why don't we let the RA give, I believe he has some slides, give a presentation on this. After that, we'll open it up to questions from both council and the public on, again, to the public, it'll be just questions, and then we will get to public comment after that.
Thanks. So I'm going to try to share my screen if Stephen will let me. Oh, it's not defining share. Stephen, it says its share screen failed. Sorry for the delay, folks. Yeah, it says it's unable. Click that again.
Yeah.
Like there aren't any. All right, Stephen, I'm just gonna email you the PowerPoint. All right, I just sent that. You got it?
I normally feel the need to fill the awkward silence, but in Manhattan, there is no silence, is there? It's a cacophony, really.
While we're waiting, I'll just note a couple things that came up during the discussion that I wanted to clarify that aren't actually part of the slides that I was going to show. So I wanted to just clarify that the way, and Hayden covered this, but I don't think as clear as I was hoping to make it. There's a distinction in the regs between the 80% threshold and closing the fishery. So Hayden showed the reg that said will be harvested, and that could be inferred as we could do a projection to close the fishery when 100% of the quota has been reached. But the 80% threshold is the part where it says has been attained. And that's, so it's the trigger for the 80%, at the 80% threshold to reduce the possession limit requires us to actually see that 80% has been reached before we can implement the possession limit reduction. And that has an impact when you're looking at, and this is one of the first slide that I'll talk through. So we couldn't do a projection for the 80%, but we did do a projection to close the fishery. But those two things happened so quickly that it almost was irrelevant. And it's still a little bit, it's not as clear as it could be, I think, in the regs. And that's why we were suggesting. And so I'm reading the long fin and squid regs as an example. And it says nymphs shall close the directed fishery when the RA projects that 90% of the quota is harvested. And the ILX regs say the same thing. Nymphs shall close the directed fishery when the RA projects that 94% of the DAH is harvested. And so when Hayden presented in her presentation that we had suggested providing this projection language in the regs, we would want to do that. So reduce the possession limit when the threshold, we project that the threshold has been reached, but also close the fishery when we project that the quota has been reached. But with that sort of preamble, I'm just going to walk through some pictures, which you've already seen because Hayden kind of presented this, but I was just going to highlight, this is the complete, as of last Thursday, winter one landings for the season. And I just want to highlight, so each dot, remember, is a week. That's the week in which we publish, when we publish the quota update. And so if you look at the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 dots, what you see is the landings trajectory was pretty much right on the unity line, the green line, and pretty consistent with last year's rate, although a little bit higher. So for the first month, things looked like a little over a month. They looked like they were proceeding as they had in past years, although maybe, slightly higher landings. And then you can see there were 2, 3 weeks, 4 weeks where things just went bananas. And that's, again, that's in hindsight with complete landings, records in our report. And if you can go to the next slide, Stephen. So, we ended up with an overage of almost 1.8 million pounds. Next slide. And that's the 80% threshold that I just wanted to throw in. That's when we, under the regs, we would have reduced the possession limit. You go to the next slide. So the circle that I just threw in there, that's showing when we would have known that 80% had been attained, that we could have initiated the action to reduce the possession limit. If you go to the next slide, the arrow is basically when we would have been able to publish that the possession limit had been, and that's under best case. And that's under sort of the best case scenario is when we could have published that the 80% threshold had been reached. But of course, by that point in time, basically the whole quota had been reached. So when we realized that's where we were, instead of proceeding with the 80% threshold possession limit reduction, we transitioned and just pivoted to the closure, which we then implemented like a week after that because of the time it took to get things published. Next slide. So why did that happen? So again, that was showing you sort of with perfect information what happened with the landings. This is showing the impact of one other aspect of that, and that's this year we saw sort of, I'll call it unprecedented amount of late reports from dealers. And I'm not trying to place blame, that's why I said it was a perfect storm of circumstances. The rate of landings and catch was much higher than we'd seen previously. And there was actually a literal storm that I think was contributed to this in southern New England. But in 2025, you can see the green bars were winter one landings that were reported each week that were for the week. So in other words, like the complete on-time reports. And the little red bars that, you know, jump up by a couple of percentage points each week were the landings in that week that were reported late. In 2026, the picture looks very different. If you go to the next slide. For the first, I'll say like 6-7 weeks, the green bars looked pretty consistent with last year's trend. But then in weeks 6, 7, 8 is when we saw, you know, significant late reports, which of course we didn't know about. So if you go to the next slide. So in week 8, you know, we thought, oh, wow, we've seen a big jump in landings. But we'd actually, the big jump in landings had started 2 or 3 weeks prior. And there was no way to resolve that. If you go to the next slide. So in weeks 6, 7, and 8, the combination of the late reports in those 3 weeks was 1.5 million pounds. And we went over 1.78 million pounds in winter one. So this was a contributing factor. It wasn't the only factor, but it was certainly a contributing factor to our ability to react to and respond to the landings as they were occurring, to make a decision in terms of when the fishery should be, when the 80% threshold had been reached, to reduce the possession limit, and then 2, when to close the fishery. And so our ability to our lack of an ability to project when that 80% threshold had been reached, in combination with the late reports, meant that by the time we knew that 80% had been caught, basically the whole quota had already been caught. And then by the time we were able to then get the closure notice in place, we were already substantially over, and we should have closed, you know, probably 2 weeks sooner. Can you go to the next slide? I'm not sure there's, okay. So just for context, just sort of comparing the last couple of years. So this table shows, you know, the total landings in winter one for the last 3 years, including this year, the quota for those 3 years, the percent of the quota that had been landed, and the total late reports during the quota period. So 1.2 million pounds in 2024, which is about 13% of the total quota. Less than 700,000 pounds last year, which was 7.5% of the total quota, and almost 2.6 million pounds this year, which was over 32% of the quota. So, and again, you know, with the rate so high in those middle weeks, and the impact of the late reports, and our inability to project, make a decision based on a projection, is where I think what led to, in part, this perfect storm. I think the other aspect of that is, which was driving probably the increase in landings, was that people weren't fishing for other things. So they were really focused on scup this year. And so, you know, when we talk about a framework adjustment, which we're very supportive of, I think there's a few things that we can directly confront and address. One is the very simple fix of providing us the ability to make projections based on the landings reports and make decisions in the future like we do for squid and mackerel and other fisheries. But the second piece might have to be looking at the source of the data that we're getting. And in those other fisheries where we see, you know, potentially very rapid landings within a very short period of time, the other piece of data that we have to use in our projections are hail weights from the vessels. And so if we're, you know, in winter one, if we had a system where we could get VMS or IVR hails from vessels, then we wouldn't have to wait for the weekly quota updates that come in from the dealers. We could roll those vessel reports into our projections. And then I think we would be, like Rich suggested, we would be able to make much more precise projections about, based on vessel activity and what the vessels are bringing in, when they're going to hit the 80% threshold and when they're going to hit the total quota. And that will allow us to, like we do in a number of other fisheries, have much more precision in terms of when we make those actions and when we get those implemented. And so, you know, when we talk about a potential framework adjustment, I would put that on the table as well. With that, I'll stop and see if there's any questions.
Okay, thank you, Mike. I'll look around the table first. I'll start with Lori. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mike, this late reports, is that non-compliance, or is that you're just saying like the lag in the weekly reporting is creating this, or are these late reports as in not in compliance?
So I think it's a combination of things. I think you know, we get a report from a dealer. They're required to report every week, I think by Tuesday for the prior week. Sometimes those reports come in a little bit late. They don't come in on Tuesday, they come in on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. But that affects, you know, when we run the projection, when we run the quota update model and all. So we can only use the data that are submitted on by the certain date. Sometimes dealers are reporting, but then they make a correction. And so but the difference between the initial report and the corrected data can sometimes be fairly substantial. And so those kind of two aspects of it might be the lack of report right away, or it might be a correction that increases. Oh, we thought we only landed 100,000 last week, but it was actually 200,000. And so those have an effect as well, obviously.
Okay, I believe I had several hands already. I think I had Tony Kearns, and then I'll go to Chris.
Thanks for that presentation, Mike. I would argue at week 3, we started to see significant late reports. It was 40%, and then week 3, 4, and 5 probably averaged 40% late reporting. I think I'm reading those weeks correctly from your slides, or those are weeks each bar. And so I'm just curious, once you start seeing that significant late reporting, are you able to project with that in mind, saying we think that there's going to be some late reports here because we've had 3 weeks consistent, and are you able to project out those late reports? And then secondly, are there communications back to those dealers that are reporting late to say, you're reporting late, you need to be reporting on time in season?
Right. So, I mean, our reporting staff, you know, they do reach out to dealers. They are in touch with them. Our port agents are in touch with them as well. I think the challenge is, if looking at the graph that showed the 2 years, yeah, it was week 4 where 40% of the landings that week were reported late. What's not clear from this, and I would have to go back in and look at the data, is when did we know that 40% of the landings had been reported late? That might have been week 6, week 5. Some of it could have been in week 4 or week 5 actually, but it wasn't in week 4. So at that point, you know, maybe we're looking back in terms of the ability to project. you look back to the previous years, and you see the late reports were, 5%, 3% of the week's landings. So we weren't sort of prepared for the scale of late reporting that we saw this year. So it wasn't something that we were expecting or prepared to sort of account for in our projections, until it became clear that, there were a number of reports that were significantly changing our understanding of what had been caught. And so I think that's another reason why having a secondary source of information from the vessels that gives us a heads up about what's the volume of fish that are crossing the dock would help us do a better job of tracking the landings, and making these decisions when they need to be made.
Chris Batsevich.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation, Mike. Lori asked one of my questions, and I appreciate your answer in terms of corrected reports from dealers. Kind of case in point, our bluefish landings actually went down from what we had earlier in the year, and that's happened in the past. So yeah, those corrections kind of a two-way street. But Mike, just to make sure I kind of clearly understand what happened here with the late reports and all. So it's I think it's pretty clear in the table here that there was higher landings from late reports we've seen in previous years. But did we also see a higher occurrence of late reports? If it was like just not looking at pounds of fish as late reports, but just number of late reports, was it a higher percentage that we saw in 2026, or was the rate of late reports generally the same, just higher landings from those late reports?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I'd have to look into that further. We looked at this year to kind of see what was the impact of the late reports. And as you can see, we did, the fairly simple graph. But looking at sort of the number of late reports, I think is what you're asking for, the percentage of dealers with late reports, that include corrections. I want to be clear that that includes corrections. We haven't, I mean, we could look at that, but I don't know offhand.
I got Jim, and then I'll go to Lisa.
Actually, Mike answered between Lori and Chris. I'm good, so thanks.
Lisa, did you have a question for?
I did. Looking at the graph, with the late reports, it seems like 24 and 25 didn't have a lot of late reports, and when we get to 26, the late reports are 32.4%. So that seems unusual, kind of like a one-off, but sort of like the perfect storm that's been pointed out. And I think during the time period that the late reports came in, wasn't there bad weather at the time also? So it seems like that maybe the simplest way to remedy that would be just to add SCUP to the VMS or the IVR so that you have real-time reporting of what each vessel's catching, rather than do a whole big framework of something. Just add SCUP to the reporting live right on the boat.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's one of the things that we suggest taking a look at in this framework adjustment.
Yeah, and the reason, excuse me, Mike, the reason I'm saying that is to do anything else, since this was an unusual winter, I would think it would be good to let this play out for 2 or 3 years and see how that goes, because it might not always, I mean, it's hard to predict. And yeah, some boats really made out this year, and I think that's great. And that's kind of what they wait for. So if we just add SCUP to that VMS and don't touch anything else and see what happens next winter and the winter after that.
Thanks. I mean, I would still like to see the ability to make projections rather than have to wait till the landings have been attained. But you're correct. And there was a literal, I mean, that's why I said the perfect storm included a literal storms. There was that affected Rhode Island and Cape Cod, in weeks, 6, 7, 8, I think, including a storm that dumped, several feet of snow in some of the ports. And so those, that definitely was a contributing factor as well.
Bobby?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Petney, but I usually am, but wasn't there also in the early part of the year a change to SAFES itself, a rollout of a different incantation of that program that may have been a contributing factor into why we had, we did have an uptick in late reports because of, bugs in the system where, things were being kicked back or things had to be multiple entries. Anybody that's dealt with any software update knows that the first update it sucks. So I'm just kind of curious how much that kind of played a role in this.
Yeah, actually, you're 100% correct, and thanks for reminding me. I forgot that part of the storm. I think Greg yesterday said usually it's 4 or 5 things that come together before to contribute to this sort of event, and it was. And so yeah, there was a transition within ACCSP for the dealer reports this year for the dealers that report. Mostly it's the high volume dealers that do a file upload. And so the dealers that actually go into, ACCP and just enter in sort of report by report, I think were unaffected. And I'm not an expert on this, but I think the file upload dealers saw a shift in how that happened in the process, and that may have affected some dealers sort of as they worked through the kinks and the bugs in working with the new system. That could have contributed to the number of late reports. And because those file uploads tend to be the higher volume dealers, that could have sort of exacerbated the fact that, 1 or 2 dealers, 2 or 3 dealers that are high volume dealers that are having a late report issue because of the file upload system would show up as large, blips in that graph. So thanks for raising that.
Okay, I didn't see any other hands around the table. So let's go to the public. I'll start in the room and then I'll also look online for questions. So I see Bonnie, if you want to.
Bonnie Brady, NEFSA. Mike, has there ever been any kind of accountability measure given for late reporting in the past? I mean, obviously, with fishermen and what things will, we have as far as in reporting, we've got to have the VTR by the time we land at the dock completely filled out. It's not the same system, but I know when COVID happened, I had got a federal dealer report because we didn't know what we were going to do with our fish. And I thought it was 24 to 48 hours for SAFES reporting. And that may not have anything to do with this, but what kind of accountability exists?
So typically, and again, I don't want to speak outside of my wheelhouse, but our reporting staff generally, and including our port agents, will, when they see the dealer report hasn't come in that they're expecting, you usually pick up the phone and reach out. So it's mostly like initial kind of processes to reach out to the dealer, see if there's any issues, what's going on. And then if it's, a clear lack of compliance, in other words, we're not hearing back and there's no reasons given, then, there might be a phone call or forward over to Office of Law Enforcement to reach out just for a compliance check. But, the only, I say, real like firm accountability is that they can't renew their dealer permit, just like vessels with limited access permits, until you're fully compliant with your reporting. But note, as I said, like a lot of these could be corrections. So a dealer report was filed on time, and then a couple of weeks later, we get a correction that changes our understanding of what was actually landed that week and came across the dock. So that's not really a compliance issue because they reported on time, but then they're, correcting the data, which we want them to do, with no penalty. And so, I think it's a combination of factors. And, Bobby's point about the file upload system, change at ACCSP was an important one. I shouldn't have overlooked that, but that was an important factor for some of our dealers.
Thank you.
I see another hand in the back. I apologize. I don't know if you can state your name when you come to the mic. I appreciate it.
Hi, my name is Gus Lovegren. Now, I had submitted comments prior, but I'm basically reiterating them, and some things have been added as well. Hi, my name is Gus Lovegren. I am the owner and captain of the fishing vessel Lily Rose, as well as a member representing the Fishermen's Dock Cooperative in Point Pleasant, New Jersey. I'm a fourth-generation commercial fisherman with children who dream of continuing the business. My family has been in this industry for over 100 years. Sustainable fishing practices and regulations have always been at the heart of what keeps us in business. At the Fishermen's Dock Co-op, we were possibly the first group to enact self-imposed trip limits when fishing for silver hake in the 1970s and 80s. These self-imposed trip limits not only preserved the population of the species, but also regulated the markets to keep pricing consistent. Previous generations, like that of my father, began to pioneer new fisheries such as scup. They were not only finding and catching the scup, but building markets for them as well. For decades, this system has worked. However, in more recent years, the loosened regulations and increased participation have led to disastrous results, putting smaller, individually owned vessels at risk of bankruptcy. The winter of 2026 has proven to be the most difficult with the mismanagement of the scup quota by those selected to oversee it. Not only was fishing shut down 7 weeks early, but instead of being halted at 80% to allow a bycatch fishery, we were allowed to go to 118 when I wrote this, but it was actually 122%, about 1.8 million pounds over. Moving forward, we must do better. All right. I heard someone say, hey, we caught the quota. Great job. No, not when we close 2 months early, because then it becomes a discard fishery that is not sustainable. I understand we have not landed that quota in over 20 years. However, with the stricter regulations on other fisheries, it has caused greater participation in our scup fishery. We need to address this moving forward. At the co-op, we have always questioned the 50,000-pound trip limit because the boats who built this fishery are rarely capable of safely handling that size load. Those trip limits seem to have been set around the collapse of the herring and mackerel fisheries so that large processing vessels could begin to target scup as well. But at what cost? These large trip limits flooded markets and drove prices down. It created a freezer market, but that's not helping the fresh fish fishermen who started this fishery. It's hurting everyone, and with the capabilities of larger vessels being able to land 50,000 pounds daily, the biomass of scup is soon going to reflect that of herring and mackerel. Prior to these 50,000-pound daily trip limits, regulations allowed us, it set a 30,000-pound trip limit. It was 30,000 pounds bi-weekly. Every 2 weeks we could land 30,000 pounds. That was quite a drastic change. And in more recent years, some of the larger processing facilities were pushing for even less stringent regulations with trip limits up to 100,000 pounds or even unlimited, while also pushing for smaller size requirements and smaller mesh requirements. Many of us felt like the fishery we pioneered was being stolen away right from underneath us, and we feel that way again. With the 30,000-pound biweekly limit, markets were kept stable and catches were sustainable. I would like to see that idea used again, and I propose either a 30,000-pound weekly limit or a 50,000-pound biweekly limit. We cannot sustain a fishery if we are closing it 7 weeks early. And most importantly, and I understand this has been addressed, but where is that extra quota being taken from? At the Fishermen's Dock Co-op, we had very little scup landings this year. After the disruptions to our fishing grounds from Empire Wind, we did not see our normal fall or winter migration of scup, and by the time they came back, the fishery was closed. Our records show roughly a 50% reduction in landings and a complete loss of the second half of winter one. This is incredibly concerning because for several years prior to this year, and the time between March 16th and April 30th, we were showing a steady increase in landings between 200,000 and 400,000 pounds with a value of over $250,000. The winter one season has exceeded its quota by almost 1.7 million pounds, and the winter two season has only been allotted 1.5. Fall is when we catch scup at the co-op, and we average over 600,000 pounds in the fall every year with vessel prices over $1 a pound. What is going to happen to our fishery now if we lose any or all of our fall fishery will most likely be the end of the business for most of us. Generational businesses we are trying to continue for our children. And it's been hinted at that this year's overage may be taken away from next year's winter one quota, which I can understand. But if we continue with the status quo trip limits of 50,000 pounds, we're going to close even earlier. I get that this might be an odd year. There was no squid, there was no mackerel, but there's no guarantee they are going to be here next year. And for people like me who depend on scup, there will be no options. I can't go scallop fishing. I can't go ilex fishing. I can't do these other things. But these other boats that are participating in our fishery can. And when they collapse it, they leave. If this is the case, we need to set a precedent here today. I suggest making that threshold 50%, because we were calling when it was at 70% to warn you, saying this fishery is going to close, and nobody responded. We were calling in the second week in February. Nobody responded to that. So let's set a threshold for 50%. If you're not going to change this 50,000 pound trip limit, when we reach that 50% threshold, we need to lower our trip limits. Let's say 20 to 25,000 pounds. And as someone else suggested too, maybe as we reach 75%, 70%, something happens. The idea is to keep this fishery open. We cannot close it early. Scup are a massing fish. They school up and you catch them on accident sometimes when you're trying to avoid them. And someone also said that 1,000 pounds, nobody's going to go out for 1,000 pounds. Let me tell you something. When the scup regulations are 1,000 pounds, they're worth money. All right. 1,000 pounds could be worth $4,000 or $5,000 at that point, and nobody wants to kick them over the side of the boat dead. If we're not going to do a threshold, there needs to be some sort of trigger set. If we are going to close the season early, we need to get on top of it before it does. There is no success in closing a season 2 months early. The goal of the sustainable season should be to keep it open. The council must realize that their actions and/or interactions have dire consequences for real people with families. While the mismanagement of this fishery has enriched a few large processing facilities, it may be what ends the small independently owned and run vessels and businesses. We can do better, and we must. Let's talk about new limits that don't just cater only to the largest vessel. Let's talk about historical landings. Do we need to look at tiered systems like we did with Lalago squid? Changes are drastically needed, and we need to find something that works. I had written a few things down. One of the first slides I saw was that this council was created to prevent derby-style fishing. Prevent, but that is exactly what happened this year. And I have never seen a successful derby-style fishing. We're looking at the results of that with what happened to scallops. You know, I don't know who was in charge of shutting us down at 80%. I don't know who was watching it, but they failed. And the late reporting, anything. I don't know who needs to be held accountable, but the reactions and what's going to happen to small independent businesses like my own are going to be dire. If we make it to next season, I will be surprised, because I am a scup fisherman. This is my bread and butter, and it's been taken away from us this year. We have to do better. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Before we get new hands, I do want to keep this to questions before the council does take any action or decides to not take an action. I will give the public a chance to comment. But if there are questions, I see Mr. Fletcher's hand is up. And just to be clear and fair, Bonnie, since you did keep it to questions, if you do have comment when that time is appropriate, you will get another chance at it. Just want to make sure everyone understands that. Do I see hands up for questions yet in the room? Yep, sorry, go ahead, Greg. And then I'll go to Mr. Fletcher.
Greg DiDomenico, Lund's Fisheries. Just Dr. Moore, if I could just ask a quick question of staff and of the regional administrator. Can you go to the graph, the bar graph that shows the late reportings? No, actually, I'm sorry, Mike, excuse me. Can you go back to the trajectory where you have a circle over one particular date? Thank you. Sorry. Great, thank you. What date is that, Mike?
Probably mid-February.
Second, third,
But
okay.
again, at the time, see, this is the thing. You're looking at all those late reports are now incorporated into this graph. At the time that we had that, and I can't recreate the past, but the landings would have appeared to be much lower because the late reports hadn't come through yet. And so it's like only in hindsight can we say, oh, we crossed the 80% threshold on February 21st or something, or whatever that was.
Thank you for saying that. That makes my next question maybe more relevant. Are you able, and I don't mean for you to share them with us, but are you able to look at the late reportings and make some judgment call whether or not they were revisions or just late?
I mean, I'm sure our team can do that. Yeah.
Because I think there should be a difference between an intentional late reporting and a mistake. And I'm sure there's some that are a mistake given the ACCSP issue. But I would really like to know if some of them are intentional, because that would be unfair. Thank you.
Follow up, Mike?
I think, Greg, to your point though, it's really hard to understand intention or infer intention. I mean, there's late reports because they were trying to get the file upload system to work. There's late reports because there's 2 feet of snow on the dock and you can't get to the office. There's there's a number of reasons why reports may not have been submitted on time that are not nefarious. And so I think it's, while I agree that, we should do the best job we can to reach out and talk to the dealers and find out what's going on, trying to infer intention and whether it was, they were trying to mislead us in terms of what was being landed. That's not something that we can really get into.
That really helps because now we know what to focus on. Because without those 1.5 million pounds, we'd have a different situation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to go to members of the public that are online that may have a question. I saw James Fletcher. Go ahead, Jim.
My question is, did the presenter ever factor in the imports of tilapia as being a reason that we got more production? And the other thing of it is, given the solar cycles and stuff, we all saw the northern lights. We can predict that there's going to be a increase in landings because there's an increase in fish, and the Science Center will be 3 years behind it. But the main point is the imports of tilapia are driving this market, and it's not being addressed. Can we ask the presenters to show the amount of imports of tilapia from China and South America at every presentation coming up? We're dancing around this late reporting and stuff, and we're not getting to where the true problem is. The true problem is imports, and tariffs has really shaken up the price of these fish, and we're not addressing it. Thank you for your time. James Fletcher, United National Fishermen's Association.
All right, thank you, Mr. Fletcher. I think that it's something that we can certainly consider, and maybe something that would start with maybe that's presented to the APs first. So we had one other hand up with questions, and that would be Mark Phillips. Go ahead, Mark.
I think I hit the unmute button.
Yeah,
Did I? Probably only Chris Moore and Bobby Rule, because of Bobby's father, know how involved I was with writing the SCUP plan back in the 90s. So my comments are, I'd like to read, there are actually some good things about the SCUP closure. The council, the Science Center, and the agency should be patting themselves on the back for the SCUP resource, for the scup resource being so large. From Hudson Canyon, 25 to 30 miles northeast, 5 to 6 miles I just lost my train of thought, so I'm sorry. But I'll reserve my comments for later. Thank you.
Well, that's good. I appreciate that because this is a time for questions, Mr. Phillips, but
Okay.
we'll certainly get back to you. And I have Eric Reed's hand up. Go ahead, Eric.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, everybody. I have a process question because I think we have to provide opportunities to the fleet as a whole. I mean, it's already been said that there was no squid on the bank this year and price of fluke was down. Hopefully this conversation will go towards an expedited framework on SCUP, but what also needs to happen in order to provide other opportunities for the fleet is an expedited framework on mackerel. The quota on mackerel went up quite a bit, as we all know, but probably Dr. Moore, this is for you. Can you do two frameworks, one to address this SCUP issue and one to address the mackerel trip limits in an expedited form for both?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Not in the same framework. It'd be two separate frameworks. And I know that we do have the mackerel issue on our radar. We'll probably talk about mackerel a little bit this week even, but not in the same framework, no.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, Dr. Moore. And I wasn't inferring that it would be in the same framework. I'm reasonably aware that it would have to be two different actions, but those two things are going to have to go hand in hand because the fleet is just running out of options, especially when one of the three fish we make money on in the winter is not on the bank. So I appreciate your answer. Thank you.
Yeah, and just to follow up, Eric, we are, Jason and I have been talking about it quite a bit. So again, stay tuned. We'll see what we can do.
Okay, with that, I'm going to bring it back to the table. Interested on the will of the council here. There is a staff recommendation that would require a motion. If folks think that might be the easiest way to get a discussion started, I'm not opposed to doing that. I will say though that how kind of open-ended this becomes, or how specific, or as Chris mentioned, how potentially complicated it could be. I think that may change our discussion as well. I see a couple hands. Bobby, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, and when the time comes, if you want me to make a motion, I'll be happy to do that. I do have a question for Mr. Petney, and it's kind of in a hypothetical sense. If we had the ability for the winter one of 2026, where we actually had VMS daily reporting or pre-landing notifications, how would that have played out differently with the, in combination with the timeliness of the reporting? Meaning that when you have your VTR, you have your dealer reports, unbeknownst to you that there's quite a few that are going to be late, especially if they're the higher volume trips, but you have an indicator by the pre-landing notifications or VMS notifications. How do you kind of manage which one you use for said, for your projections?
So very good question, and thanks for that. I would say that the ability to have data coming in from the vessels would allow us to, along with the dealer data that we have in hand, make a more informed projection about what's actually happening each, week to week, and be more precise in being able to say, okay, well, given, X number of vessels landing 800,000 pounds per week, then we project that they're going to hit the 80% threshold next Tuesday. And then we could implement the possession limit reduction based on that projection. And so it would definitely help us would give us more data. It would be closer to real time. And it would allow us to make a more informed, precise projection. So I think it would be very helpful to us. It's what we use in some of the other high volume fisheries. And we've been generally pretty successful with those. And so I think extending that practice to scup in winter one would, be a step forward in avoiding this. And we wouldn't be as reliant on the once per week dealer reports to understand what's happening in the fishery.
Okay, thanks. Any other comments or questions around the table? If not, Bobby, if you don't mind getting us started, I'll look to you for a motion to get us started.
I'll look to Hayden to have one pre-written because
My clicker is not working, but I do have a draft motion. Is Stephen able to advance the slides? Well, while we wait for Stephen to help us, oh, there we go. Okay, thank you. I just want to add that I know that this draft motion is a bit specific to the winter one trip limit regulation, so I don't know if anyone would be interested in wordsmithing it a little bit to reflect potential changes in terms of like adding scup to VMS.
Well, I think that's a good question. I don't know if we can maybe look to Mike as far as your view on the importance of that being specified in the motion.
I would just suggest that at least for the record that, we would support looking at the vessel hail reports through VMS or IVR to be incorporated and considered in this, and also potentially a change to the accountability measure as well. And I think, the accountability measure in particular, I know Hayden in one of her early slides, showed two potential timelines, one with the council taking final action in August and one with the council final action in December. We would encourage the council to be as expedient as possible and aim to take final action in August if we're going to try to adjust the accountability measure.
All right, so I don't know if there's anyone that wants to try and tackle that word smithing. Oh, I have a question. Go ahead, Joe Chris.
Yeah, so how specific do we need the motion? Because I'm thinking we need to make sure we can do projections, VMS, and I know there's some want to deal with the overage payback only if the annual is exceeded. So I think those three are on the table. I'm seeing a lot of head nods. So how specific do we need to make this motion to those points exactly, or do we need to still leave it a little open-ended so staff can kind of get this formulated and not see the RA has it?
Yeah, I think it would be helpful to, I think to let Mike respond, and then, if there's any council considerations as well, but go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, actually, it was Morris from the back of the room just suggested we delete trip limit, and then it's just management flexibility built into the winter one regulations. And I think that would encompass everything that we're trying to do. And, we can use the first framework meeting to kind of define out the details about what that would entail.
I like it. So perhaps if somebody if we could actually edit the slide to a suggestion like that. Yeah, that's a good suggestion. So we'll have either if it could be SCUP framework or SCUP winter one regulations. Perhaps the second might be a little better. Okay, we think we have something wordsmith to be fair. Mr. Rule's still interested?
Yeah, it's fine, because if I were to attack that verbiage, I would butcher the hell out of it. Move to initiate a framework action to consider building management flexibility into the SCUP Winter 1 regulations.
Second by Joe Grist. Comment on the motion from the maker.
Oh, yeah, I mean, there's been a multitude of justification for it, led for us. Not only that, it does bring, it would bring SCUP in lockstep with other high volume fishery management practices, utilizing the same metrics and giving the RA the same flexibility. It's something that for somehow or another got overlooked because it was never an issue for many years. And now we're just rectifying a problem from the past.
To the seconder, Joe, any other additional?
No, I think it covered. I think we've had enough discussion on this. The other question I do have, maybe this goes to Dr. Moore, would it help in the motion if we said expedited or not for the framework? Just because we do want this to be expedited. Don't need it? Okay.
We're good. Thank you.
Good.
Appreciate that. Okay. So around the table, discussion on the motion. Michelle Duval, and then I'll go to
Thanks,
Tony.
Mr. Chair. Just want to express my support and for, the expedited timeline, because it seems like that's, if we wait until December, it just becomes moot. So again, reflecting, taking final action at I guess would be the August meeting instead of later. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. Lori Nolan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Everything Michelle said, and I think we all have to take accountability that we can't pile too many more things into this. We have the 3 things highlighted, and while we're not listing them, I think we all have to understand that that's kind of the limit on this. And trip limits can be adjusted through specifications if that is something people want to go forward with, and just keep this tight and clean.
Yeah, and I also appreciate the RA's comments on, what that first framework meeting might look like for us in defining some of this. Tony Kearns, apologies, Tony, I missed your hand earlier.
No worries. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to note, not in saying favor or against the framework action, but just that if we adjust the accountability measures, the commission would need to do an addendum to adjust. I'm trying to quickly on the fly figure out what portion of the regs we would need, or what portion of the FMP we would need to adjust. Because even Maura and I were just talking, even in the older version, which is what we may have on the books, you still adjusted paybacks quota period by quota period, and then that changed slightly with the AMs, which we may or may not have adopted, which I'm trying to figure out. So there would be action, though, for the paybacks by the commission, which I don't know if that slows you down in a way that wouldn't allow you to adjust for next year, if that is even possible through the framework action.
Okay, well, Chris, do you have a question? And then I'll try and think that through a little as well.
Yeah, probably the same question you might have, which is I'm a little confused by that, right? In terms of, and we sort of have to settle as to exactly how we're going to have the commission involved with this particular action so that we could start dealing with the logistics of the June meeting. Yeah, obviously you all are going to be there for the August meeting, but yeah, I just need to know exactly what we need to do with the commission. So typically when we deal with scup or black sea bass or fluke or bluefish, we involve the commission, right? Even in this particular action, we may want to involve the commission just because it's a species that you're interested in and that you jointly manage with us. So I would think that maybe what we just do is say that we're going to have a joint meeting in June. Your folks can attend virtually, to reduce your cost if you want, and plan it that way. But certainly I'd like to hear from you as to how we should proceed.
So if the document adjusts the accountability measures, then I do think that the commission needs to make an adjustment to the FMP, and I definitely think that we need to work together, whether or not it has to be in lockstep or not. We need to have some conversations that we just haven't been able to have yet. If we're only adjusting the regs, then I don't know, I would need to talk to the board chair to determine whether or not that's something the board would feel they want to be a part of that conversation or not, in order to, because those would be only changes that you make in the regs. And in the intent of, I think what we have on the books, we didn't realize that you couldn't use projections to account for what we thought the landings were going to be. And so that is in the intent of the FMP in my mind. And so I don't know how involved the board would want to be or not.
Right. Okay. Well, I think, perhaps moving forward, the council will assume that it's a joint meeting. If something changes, Tony, for the board, then, when you have a chance, the board chair might be around, and then I'm sure you want to talk to the commission chair and Bob as well. So if you can just work with us and let Chris and I know that, but I think it might be safest thing because of time is that, as Chris mentioned, we want the board to at least be a part of the discussions if they can, if they want to have a full-on board meeting. I think even if they decided for some reason not to, that we certainly want to let the board know to be listening in, as we start this process. Okay, did we have other hands around the table for discussion on the motion? Not seeing any. Okay, so here it is, the big one. We're going to go out to the public for comments on the motion. John?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. John Maniscalco, New York State DEC. Generally in supportive of the motion. I think we do need to take some action to protect kind of the small boats, small ports, fresh fish market from, this happening again. Little mixed on the VMS requirement, and I'm hoping that if the council chooses to investigate that, we have some kind of analysis that lets us know how many vessels that are currently permitted for the scup fishery already have or do not have VMS. And I'd love to hear from industry, either around the table or in the public, regarding what the burden of installing and running VMS on their vessels looks like. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Other hands, back of the room, if you can state your name when you come up, please.
There it is. Good morning, Warren Kremen, Blue Ribbon Fish Company, from the Fulton Fish Market. Fourth generation fishmonger, and certainly supportive of a motion that's going to make a better fishery and sustainable fishery. And I was hoping I could offer just a brief perspective regarding maybe some of the thought process that goes into as you guys create these frameworks, and where scup is a essential value protein from the perspective of the ultimate consumer. Where I am here representing probably hundreds of companies and thousands of jobs that are dependent on the fishery for sure for economic reasons. I think it's important to maybe bring into all of this when there is a closure, it's not really management, it's a closure, and what we're doing is depriving the public of an essential protein that's affordable on a nationwide basis. And to that effect, what we saw at this closure right before Easter was the public getting up in the middle of the night, coming into the fish market for specifically the scup. And the amount of disappointment that we saw, and maybe I can just offer that perspective, that when we're thinking about creating this framework and creating limits, that when we design the fishery, that a closure of a fishery is the worst possible thing that we can do. whether it's 50,000, 30,000, to keep the boats working certainly is important, and they will bring that home for you, I'm sure. But from the perspective of the actual consumer, which I guess we're not talking about sundries or, or side pieces. We're talking about feeding a nation, and feeding a nation on domestic U.S. unadulterated protein. Fish and wild caught fish is the last unadulterated protein that we can offer to our country. And it has to be realized how important of that protein that scup really is, because it's affordable. And we see it here in the inner cities, we see it here up and down the coast, and even going out west. So we would just hope that in this process that, aside from all the jobs that are involved, that we are feeding the public, and that the consumer and the need for the consumer to have this protein is considered when you guys do the framework. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Any other hands in the room? Go ahead, Megan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Megan Lapsey-Fries. I just want to give the council members around the table a little bit of background. The background on the increased scup landings from this year is that over time, fresh markets have been shrinking and cannot absorb the volume that they once did. Seafreeze could see this coming years ago, and so we worked hard to develop MSC certification for the scup fishery, which I know I've spoken to the council about multiple times before. With that certification, we have been able to build a freezer market, which is able to offer vessels a base freezer price where they know the price that they will get before they leave the dock. This is why the squid market works. This gives vessels stability and opportunity. And this MSC certification and export market has been years of work on our part. This winter in particular was an anomaly. It was extremely cold. The water was so cold there was no squid. There were 3 species of fish available on the bank. There was mackerel, there was scup, and there was butterfish. Mackerel, you couldn't go fishing for because the trip limit still isn't increased. Butterfish, there are retaliatory tariffs. The only thing that was ultimately available for vessels to do was scup. And it was a good thing that we had developed the freezer market, because if all that scup had been dumped on the fresh market, the bottom would have dropped out of the price for everyone, and people still would have been tied to the dock. We were able to keep a lot of boats going this winter, not just our boats, but many owner-operated boats, including 3 from New York. Reducing the 50,000-pound trip limit would destroy this freezer market and the opportunity it creates. And we don't have much opportunity in commercial fisheries anymore. Developing new opportunity should be a good thing, and it is a good thing. As far as the late reports, I appreciate that Garfo noted one of the weeks that was noted actually in the staff report was when on the East Coast we got a blizzard that was worse than the blizzard of '78. The day for reporting, I know on that particular week, was the day we got 3 to 4 feet of snow, and people couldn't get out of their houses for 3 days, much less get to work. It was days before people could get actually back into the plant to report what should have been reported the day the snow came. As well as the ACCSP system that Mike mentioned. That changed this year. As we were uploading reports to that system, it was dumping them. After stuff got uploaded, it said it was uploaded. You'd check again later, and it dumped it. We tried to work with some of the port agent staff, but they hadn't been trained in the new updates yet, and so it took weeks of reaching out to ACCSP to try to get certain things fixed on that system. Next year, that won't be an issue because now we have fixed it. But I want to reiterate a lot of support for this motion. Changing the regs to allow NIMS to do closures when the fishery is projected to reach the threshold, I think is very good. As far as the VMS reporting, I've run this by boats. They already do it for lalago. They already do it for Elex mackerel. So that's not something that our boats are opposed to at all. And I think changing the payback language to Michelle's point earlier, where you only have a payback in the winter period or any period the following year when the overall commercial quota is exceeded for the year makes a lot of sense because we've been under the commercial quota in the summer period and the winter 2 period in recent years, which if that language were changed, there would probably be no payback next year anyway. So I just wanted to provide the council with that background and say that I support the motion. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. Other hands in the room, Bonnie?
Bonnie Brady, NEFSA. I do want to draw attention, when Mr. Kremen came, he gave a letter from the Korean Seafood Association of New York that is going to be added late into the comment period, but that does exist. I do want to just address, there's one comment by Nate Phillips who refers to in 2025, for the advisors, I had spoken to Hayden about looking at the 80%, seeing if there was the opportunity to be a larger quota and or going up to that point. But that was before, frankly, the overage horse left the barn, knocked over a lantern on the way and set the whole place on fire. The issue for many owner operators is they were closed out of the market completely. And that should never happen. Since forever. I think was it 2014 when it went to 30,000 pounds or when it switched over? Right. You know, we've never had this kind of an issue before. And in the letter that I wrote, I did speak about a perfect storm because it may be the same amount of boats, but some of the boats that we're catching would normally not have been. There are, I think, 589 or 529 SCUP moratorium permits. 180 of them are in confirmation of permit history. That's a lot of effort, and we saw what it could look like. So I just hope that you all do remember owner-operators, fresh fish markets that exist, and please think about those guys too. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Wayne, go ahead. If you could state your name for us.
Wayne Reichel, Lunds Fisheries. We've worked very hard for decades trying to develop markets for SCUP. We've had some winners and we've had some losers over the years. The domestic fresh market has always been a very important market to us and still is an important market to us today. And I agree with Warren that it would be great to be able to keep every pound of fish that we're producing here in the United States and have U.S. consumers enjoy them. But the reality of it is that the infrastructure that we have here in the United States does not support our fishermen. And that's what's most important. Our fishermen have, for decades, went out and fished, delivered fish to the dock, and often, when the settlement was done, there was nothing left because they couldn't pay for their fuel, they couldn't pay for their grub, and they went into the next trip at a deficit. What we've created ourselves in Seafreeze is a market for people who actually do appreciate the fish and people that are willing to pay for the fish. So our fishermen are going out and fishing as hard as they can to deliver fish to our dock, and they're getting paid for that. They're getting paid for their effort. They're getting paid for their work. It's important that we manage this fishery responsibly. We've invested a lot of money in technology. We've invested a lot of money in marketing these fish and continue to, and we're going to see more return coming back into this fishery as we continue to grow that. But reporting the same way that we do in the ELEX fishery, the technology's there, the system's there. I think this is a great motion. I think this is a great advancement for the fishery, for us to continue to report on time, and to continue managing this fishery responsibly and providing markets for fishermen, American fishermen, to be able to go out and do the work and support their families. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. I appreciate the comments. I didn't think I had any other hands in the room. One more. Oh, sorry. Katie, go ahead. You said there's.
Thank you. Katie Almeida, Sea Fresh, Handergren's Town Dock. We can support this motion. I think it's a very reasonable start to look to change some of the way we manage SCUP for the goal to keep everyone fishing for as long as we can. The goal would be to keep the fishery open through the whole winter one and not have to shut down like we did again. Let's see what looks like next year, but I don't think we should throw out the opportunity to possibly decrease the trigger or look into how we can better report by dealers. I think those are all options that we should be able to keep in our back pocket to be able to keep everyone fishing throughout the whole winter one. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think there was one other hand. Go ahead, sir.
My name is Jimmy Elliott. I own the fishing vessel Maisie James, Nautilus 2, MF High Grader, and the St. James. I did put a comment in online. I guess it got on there. I didn't know if it would. I'm the one who suggested, like, this is what happens when you trap a rat in a corner. It's going to figure out a way to claw its way out. Between no squid, drastic reductions in scallop, mackerel boats with nothing to do, newly fast growing SCUP frozen market, and some people said the price of fluke. Well, this is the very council that voted for an increase in fluke, which drove the market down with the high volume. That did play a little part in it, especially now with a fishery that's closed, driving 70 miles for a $5 fuel bill. Our triplet limit in New Jersey right now is 2,000 pounds of fluke and 3,000 pounds of bass with nothing to add on to it. Actually, I have a boat out right now trying to do a Virginia trip, and he has spent the whole day yesterday trying to drive away from SCUP. There is a biomass right now that extends from 20 miles north of the tip of the Hudson all the way down. Well, we got as far as like close to Linden Cole one trip, and there was fish all the way down there. That extends from 45 fathoms to 90 fathoms. The biomass is there. You literally have to drive away from them. You have to look for no readings right now, which is impossible. Everything is mixed in together, especially with the cold winter, the bass, the fluke, and the SCUP. So for the future, I had put in a set, I'd suggested a set of triggers that go in, lower the trigger limit. Now, talking with some fishermen and stuff like that, oh, I can't survive on 50,000 pounds. Oh, what would you have done if there was squid and there was this or was that? Well, if you put the trigger in and all the fisheries break apart themselves, where a lot of guys who would target squid go squidding, a lot of guys who target mackerel go mackerel fishing, well, it would take care of itself. The trip limit wouldn't go down then. The trigger is for when you have something like this, where there's nothing to do, to spread it out. So my example is 50,000 pound trip limit, it goes to 50%, 25,000, 75%, you drop it to 10, 85 cent, 5,000. Anything less than 5,000, I mean, you can make money on SCUP at 1,000, but the discard rate would be astronomical. And I believe if you're reporting discard rate right, it goes against the quota. Is that true? No? Okay, well, still, the discards would be high. So we need to come away where everyone could coexist. I feel this trigger limit is part of a good way to coexist. It'll keep the quota open. Like Gus, I do pack in Point Pleasant sometimes. I pack in Rhode Island. I've dealt with a freezer market. I've dealt with a fresh market. I have boats that go from New Bedford, Massachusetts, all the way down to North Carolina and pack fish year round. And, it just seems like every time there's a slow part in one fishery and one fishery gets decimated, everybody has to make a shift. Everyone's trying to survive. I get it. But I do support this, at least have the conversation in the Winter One regulations to try and be more flexible. But also on another note, you guys threw around scup and sea bass and fluke quotas, increased them like it was nothing. What can we do to get a study done on the scup? What can we do to increase that quota? Because that also, I've seen the scup quota as high as 20 million pounds for a period. Let's try and get the quota up a little bit. The biomass is there. If you want, take a ride on my boat. He can't get out of them. Having a fishery closed too early is just no good. It needs to be spread out. And that's about it. The rest of it you can read online. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate the comments. I'm going to go online to the public. I see a few hands. Mr. Phillips, if you want to provide your comments now, go ahead.
I think I've got it. My name is Mark Phillips. I've been fishing a long time, and this is my comment. I've written comments online also. There are actually some good things about the scup closure. The council, the science center, the agency should all be patting themselves on the back that the scup resource is a lot bigger than what we thought. From Hudson Canyon, 25 to 30 miles northeast, 5 to 6 miles wide. I think it's even wider than that now. From north of Tom's Canyon to Cape May Rocks, 50 to 100 fathoms. How much fish is that? When the net touches the bottom for less than a minute and you have your limit, it says there is a lot more scup out there than the surveys say there are. How do we deal with episodic fish years? How do we deal with a resource that is so big it won't let the squid come up the bank? The two species don't like each other. Ironically, there was squid at Hudson Canyon until the scup showed up and pushed them overboard. The squid either went up in the water or they're out in the coral zone approximately 200 fathom and deeper. Sometimes too much fish is a bigger problem than not enough. I cut my teeth on scup around 1965. The scup rebounded because of the 9-inch fish size. 8 3/4 inches is 95% sexual maturity for scup. It was put in to stop the harvest of small fish by commercial and recreational. It was a bitter fight, and I was hated by everyone. Commercial wanted to keep doing the same thing as normal. Recreational didn't think they were ever doing anything wrong. In the early 90s, while fighting for the 9-inch fish size, I steamed my boat, the Illusion, to Port Jefferson and took the whole council and staff for a boat ride and a mock boarding. Lars Axelson, owner of the Durston, one of the hated boats in this thing, was part of my crew. My son was in pre-K and got seasick. He's 39 now. I was doing mesh selectivity studies for scup back then. I'll be 70 this year. Bonnie's husband, Dave, is in the same age class, and we don't know how to retire. We love fishing, and maybe there should be a separate category for us, the antique participants. And then trip limits don't apply to us. That's sarcasm. The agency has to figure out dynamic management, whether it's for scup or squid. 1 year is warp speed for the agency. The agency slow walking the mackerel didn't help. Retaliatory tariffs for butterfish took away more options. The fishermen have to accept everybody gets hurt in episodic years. I have to report daily when declared into squid mackerel, which is every trip. I have to report when and where I will land that trip because I am declared into squid and mackerel. The agency knows I have 50,000 pounds of something aboard. My daily catch report says how much of each squid, how much mackerel, and total fish. Rhode Island DEM is there every trip to monitor every offload. They don't harass us if we are following the intent of the law. They are in the building all the time checking. Every state regulates landings differently, and each one has positives and negatives. Having the docks be the dealer is much easier for enforcement because the fish are loose or in totes and usually weighed as they come off the boat. The problem is quality. Most New York and some of the smaller ports use boxed at sea. The quality is unmatched because fish are handled once on the boat. The end wholesale buyer knows that the beat up boxes that came off the boats most likely has a better product. But that creates an enforcement nightmare. In the case, New York has to figure out how to balance enforcement and harassment. Haul-in and unloading for regulated species might eliminate some of that. Take the win because the stock is huge. This fight is not about fish, it's about money. I support status quo, and my concern is that if we change the status quo from the 50,000 trip limit, we're going to destroy the freezer market that is just developing, and I support that because we need more options for this product. I would love to see the fresh market be able to handle what we catch. It did back in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, but it doesn't anymore, and it will never come back. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. I have a couple more hands. I'm going to go to James Fletcher. Go ahead, Jim.
Is it any possibility after building management flexibility to add the words "and aquaculture" into the Scott winter regulations? The reason for bringing aquaculture into this is in the windmill areas, there's a possibility of holding net pens that nothing else will be able to mess with. So just if Captain Rule would allow flexibility and aquaculture into the sculp fishery. Thank you, James Fletcher, United National Fishermen's Association.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Fletcher. I mean, this is the property of the council. This motion now. I don't know that something like that couldn't be explored in the analysis that's going to be presented during the framework work. I don't think we necessarily need to have that in the motion. So I'm going to, and I don't know that we have that will to start again here. So I'm going to take the next few comments. I think Hank Lackner and then Eric Reed were the last names I saw. So go ahead, Hank. Hank, if you're speaking, we can't talk to you. Or sorry, my apologies. We can't hear you. Well, I'll.
Do you hear me now?
Yeah, there you go. Very good. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry. I thought I hit the button. All right. My name is Hank Lackner. I'm a commercial fisherman from Montauk, New York. And I've been chasing scup for a better part of the last 40 years. And I don't know if that exactly qualifies me as an antique or not, but I've been doing it for quite a while. I am in favor of the framework that is proposed. I do believe we need a little bit of flexibility built into the Winter One regulations because especially, we're talking about a fishery that is fully rebuilt and really, we don't have a problem with the fishery. We just have a problem with the actual quota allocation. So as we work through that process, I think we need to figure out a way where we don't go from a full-blown, full wide open fishery at a 50,000 pound trip limit and then go to a total closure. I think, Warren highlighted a little bit of that aspect of how it works. And I think it's just a shame that we went from where we are till now. And I think we can figure out a way using VMS where we can control the fishery and keep a line on exactly how many pounds are being caught, and then implement possibly a lower trip limit down the line. But I definitely feel that the fishery should never close. I also think, when we mention VMS and we talk about VMS for any of the guys who are offshore, and this kind of goes back to what John Maniscalco was wondering, it's no big deal for us. It's just adding another macro to our VMS. We hit it and we go in and we just report what we're catching daily, which will help the service keep track of exactly how fast the fishery is being persecuted. We did it with Elex squid. We've done it with loligo. There's no reason we can't do it with scup. And I guess the last thing that I really like to talk about that I haven't heard anyone, well, I'd also like to say I'm in favor of keeping the 50,000 pound trip limit for at least part of the winter period, if not all of it. And it is very important to preserve the freezer market that was developed by Lunds and Seafreeze and some of the other guys. It has been a big bonus to the fleet, but in the next breath, maybe the fleet has gotten too big or the potential to get too big. And I think the council should be looking long and hard at establishing a control date for scup. We need to know how many players we actually have and how many are going to be in the fishery, which will help us make better management decisions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate those comments. Eric Reed?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Eric Reed, North Kingstown, Rhode Island. I do appreciate this motion, especially the expedited timeline and the recognition that, I mean, there's a lot of sides still between different facets of the industry, but adjusting the accountability measure to not lose 2 million pounds in 2027 benefits everybody. And I really appreciate you focusing on that particular topic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the comments and for that very robust discussion. I'm going to bring it back to the table now. Just to be clear, as Mike Pentney had suggested, for the record at least, that this is kind of, an expedited timeframe. We'll be reviewing this again, potentially with the board in June. I'm going to ask, I hope, the easy question. Is there any objection to the motion? Any abstentions? Not seeing any. Okay, we'll consider the motion passed by consent. Hayden, is there anything else you need on this?
Nope, I think I have all the clarity I need to get started on this. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mike. I appreciate that extra information for what we hadn't seen before. With that, let's take a quick break. If the council folks could get back in 5, I appreciate that. We're running a little bit behind, but I think we'll be able to get back on. Thanks. If council members could start making their way back to the table, please. And if we can get all conversations moved into the hallway, that would be appreciated. We're going to get started in a minute. All right, let's please get started here again. We have one more agenda item before lunch. So I think we can get back on or close to schedule. If not with this agenda item, we'll work it out. But I know you guys always do your best. So we're going to be talking multi-year specifications. We have Julia and Rhiannon here with us from staff. I think things are getting fairly quiet, folks. So whenever you guys are ready, I'll turn it over to you and you can get started. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everybody. So the objectives of this presentation are to review the staff memo and consider initiating an omnibus management action related to the multiple year specifications frequencies. So the tasking from the council was to develop a white paper to evaluate potential modifications to the multiple year specifications frequencies for council FMPs. This was included in the 2026 implementation plan and also in the council's response to Executive Order 14276. And I just wanted to briefly point out that the way this is phrased is for a white paper, but we ended up formatting it as a staff memo instead because it includes some recommendations from staff related to initiating a management action. So just wanted to point out that even though it's formatted as a staff memo, it's intended to address the intent of the white paper. So next, I will try to quickly walk through what's in the staff memo. So first of all, why does the council set multiple year specifications? You may not all be aware that prior to around the mid-2000s, the council set catch and landings limits for each species for 1 year at a time. But eventually each FMP was updated to allow the council to set specifications for multiple years at a time. As you can imagine, multiple year specifications have a number of benefits compared to setting specs for just 1 year at a time. So a big advantage is that it reduces the administrative burden on the council and NIMS when you set specs for multiple years at a time, because then there's less work and meetings and documentation and analysis that needs to happen every single year, and different steps in the rulemaking process. So it's a big efficiency that way. But it's also important because it can increase predictability for fishery participants if the council's stating what the, for example, the quotas are expected to be for maybe 3 years into the future as opposed to just 1 year at a time. So one reason why the council expressed an interest in evaluating the current multi-year specs frequencies is that the maximum duration of the multiple year specs currently varies by species. So for most species, the FMPs allow specs to be set for up to 3 years at a time. And I'm not going to read out all the species listed on the screen there, but you can see that it's a lot. For spiny dogfish, specs can be set for up to 5 years at a time. And for surf clams, ocean quahogs, and golden tilefish, specifications can be set up to the maximum number of years needed to be consistent with the NRCC approved stock assessment schedule. So next I will walk through why it's different for those species and what was the intent behind that phrasing. So this phrasing of allowing specifications to be set up to the maximum number of years needed to be consistent with the NRCC approved stock assessment schedule was a change that was implemented through Amendment 20 for surf clams and ocean quahogs and Framework 7 for tilefish, which only applied to golden tilefish, not also blue line tilefish. Both of those actions addressed other topics as well, and this was just part of those management actions. And both of these actions were implemented in 2022, so it's a little bit more of a recent change for these species. The reason this change was made was that previously these species could also have specs set for up to 3 years at a time, which at one point in time was aligned with the stock assessment, the frequency of the stock assessment updates. But eventually over time, the assessments for these species began to be updated over longer, less frequently than 3 years for a variety of reasons, including things like changes in the survey platform for surf clams and ocean quahogs, funding considerations. There's also some life history characteristics and relatively stable fishery performance that all kind of supported leaving these specifications in place for longer periods of time, and were also reasons why the assessments weren't updated as frequently as they used to be. So when the council agreed to the language on the screen here, where it says it's consistent with the NRCC approved stock assessment schedule, that was intended to provide additional flexibility to cover the time between stock assessment updates, and a certain number of years was intentionally not specified because the length of time between assessments can vary. Therefore, the council now considers the appropriate number of years each specification cycle. And this language does not require the council to tie the specifications timing exactly to the assessment schedules, and the council has the flexibility to justify what is considered consistent. So for those of you, I've mentioned the NRCC schedule a few times. For those of you who aren't totally sure what I mean by that, just a quick refresher. The NRCC is the Northeast Region Coordinating Council and includes leadership from the Mid-Atlantic and New England Councils, the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, GARFO, and the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. The NRCC agrees to an assessment schedule that balances the needs of member agencies and available resources. The NRCC process has resulted in a mostly predictable assessment schedule until recently. This was really useful for management for a number of years. We were pretty confident that most of the time we would get assessments on these predictable schedules. Every once in a while something happened, an assessment was delayed or the schedule needed to be modified, but generally the schedule was pretty consistent and predictable. Until recently, as we all know, the ability of the Science Center to maintain these schedules has been impacted by reductions in the federal workforce and data collection, which means that there's lots of ongoing conversations about what this means for the assessment schedules moving forward. But right now, the future frequency and type of scientific information for all of the NRCC assessments is currently uncertain. So what I mean by type of scientific information is, for example, do we get a data update or a management track assessment or a research track assessment? Some of that is going to be changing. And again, there's lots of ongoing conversations related to that. In terms of what the assessment schedule means for how we set specifications, it's also important to keep in mind that 2 stocks managed by the council don't have NRCC assessments. One of them is chub mackerel, which doesn't have any stock assessment at all due to extreme data limitations. And blue line tilefish does have an assessment, but it's assessed through the CDAR process in the Southeast. And the Mid-Atlantic Council does not have a direct role in the priorities or scheduling for CDAR assessments. The most recent assessments for blue line tilefish took place in 2017 and then again in 2025, and it's uncertain when the next blue line assessment will be. Both of these 2 species currently have specs that can be set for up to 3 years at a time, so you can imagine that this isn't, currently aligned with assessment schedules for them. So, given all that context, staff suggests a few potential revisions which the council may wish to consider regarding the maximum duration of multi-year specs. So, for example, the council could consider revising the FMPs so that all species that have stock assessments could have multi-year specs set up to the maximum number of years needed to be consistent with the approved stock assessment schedule. So similar to the current language for surf clams, ocean quahogs, and golden tilefish. And then for species without an approved stock assessment, such as chub mackerel right now, perhaps the council may wish to consider allowing specifications to remain in place until modified based on updated information. And the intent behind these suggestions are to do things like have greater consistency across the FMPs, greater efficiency in the management process, and better alignment between the science and management timelines. The intent here is not to encourage a longer duration of specifications for all species and all circumstances. We know that some species may benefit from more frequent revisions than others. But rather the intent here is to allow additional flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances and to allow the council to decide on the appropriate duration of specifications on a case-by-case basis. So if the council wants to consider these types of changes through a management action, it may also be a good opportunity to consider clarifying the process the council will use in years when specs are set and in interim years when they are reviewed. So this table summarizes the typical steps in the process for setting and reviewing specifications in recent years. Not all these steps are strictly required, and the process can vary depending on the circumstances. So this is just intended to be a general example. I know the text is kind of small and there's a lot of information on the screen, and I'm not going to walk through it all, not expecting you to read through it all right now. But one key point is that right now, many of the same steps take place in years when specs are set and in the interim years when they are reviewed. For example, in both cases, staff develop fishery information documents, the advisory panels develop fishery performance reports, and the SSC and monitoring committees meet to discuss the specs. One key difference in the process in years when specs are set and when they are reviewed is that the discussions are more focused in those interim review years because they focus on the question of, is there any new information to suggest that a change is needed from what was previously adopted? In these interim review years, we usually don't have updates to the stock assessment or to the stock projections. We're usually only getting an additional year or two of fishery and survey catch data. Therefore, revisions in the interim review years are pretty rare. And when there's no change to specs in those interim review years and the previously set multiple year specs just remain in place, staff do not need to prepare additional rulemaking documents, which is a big efficiency in the process because depending on the circumstances, the documents that staff need to prepare after the council adopts or revises specs, sometimes those can take quite a while to complete depending on the level of analysis that's needed. So if the council wants to, again, if you're going to initiate a management action to deal with the multiple year specs frequencies, this is a good opportunity to, again, clarify the process for what will happen in spec setting and review years. So I put that slide up with the table that describes the general process that currently happens, but that's not exactly how it's described in all of the FMPs or the regs. In some cases, the FMPs and the regs contain pretty outdated language that don't accurately reflect the way we currently do things. In some cases, there's overly prescriptive language about really specific things that the council should consider and really specific timeframes, which again doesn't reflect current practice or may no longer be necessary or practical. So the council may wish to consider just kind of cleaning all that up, clarifying the process, and maybe providing the council with some flexibility for specific steps that it might want to take in any given year. So there could be differences in the circumstances where, for example, right now we have some species that have been getting updated assessments every other year. So we only have one interim year before we get a new assessment. In a case like that, maybe we don't need to do quite so many steps in that single interim year. We can just wait till we get the assessment update the next year and then react to it. But if there's a species or situation where the assessment is updated less frequently, maybe there needs to be a higher level of interim year review. So the staff suggestion is to kind of clarify and clean up how that's all described in the FMPs and the regs, but allow flexibility for the council to decide on the appropriate level of review on a case-by-case basis. And there are some recent examples of changes to FMPs that have kind of done things along these lines. One of them is from Surf Clam and Ocean Quahog Amendment 20 and also Tilefish Framework 7, which are the two actions that I previously mentioned. And they clarified what would happen in the spec setting and review years. And what they say in these actions is very simple. It just says that new specs will be prepared in the final year of the multi-year specs period, unless there's a reason to have interim modifications. And in those years when new specs are prepared, or there's a reason to revise the previously set specs, it just says staff will produce a recommendation memo. And in those interim review years, these actions say that staff will coordinate with the Science Center during the first quarter of the year to assess whether there's any relevant new info, and those results will be presented in a memo. So it's pretty simple. This does not prevent the council from still asking the SSC to review the ABCs, having the monitoring committees meet, having the AP meet, preparing fishery information documents. All those things have still been happening in recent years, but it's not saying that all those steps are strictly required. It's just giving the council, again, the flexibility to add on more than this and trying to kind of keep it more simple in terms of what's in the FMP. Another recent example of a similar type of change comes from the New England Council's Omnibus Management Flexibility Action. The New England Council took final action on this in September of last year, and it's currently pending rulemaking. This action did a number of things, but related to this specific example, it removed some requirements that previously existed for very specific annual review steps and specific reports. And instead it clarifies that the New England Council will decide on the timing and content of reviews and reports for each year through the annual priority setting process. So again, if the council wants to consider any of these types of changes that I mentioned, the council would need to initiate a management action to make those changes. So the one thing to think about is what type of management action would be most appropriate. So should it be an FMP amendment or a framework adjustment? As most of you are aware, amendments are useful for novel, more complex, or more controversial changes, while frameworks generally address changes that are within the scope of the existing FMP. Frameworks can sometimes be completed in less time than amendments because, unlike amendments, the council does not hold scoping or public hearings, and there are fewer steps in the rulemaking process. However, I can tell you firsthand that frameworks do sometimes take a very long time to complete. And the length of time to complete an action is also highly influenced by the complexity of the issues under consideration, as well as other priorities and workload considerations. So it's not always the case that frameworks are completed in less time than amendments. Another thing to think about is each of the FMPs and the regulations have a list of measures which can potentially be modified through a framework as opposed to requiring an amendment. And the specific lists are included in Table 4 in the briefing materials if you want to see specifically what's on each list. But this is just here summarizing a key take-home message is that for most of the council species, on the list of measures that can be modified through a framework, there's an item that says something like any other measures currently included in the FMP. So that applies to most species the councils manage. Golden and blue line tilefish have a smaller list of measures that are included on the framework list that still encompasses most aspects of the FMP, but it's not as encompassing as many of the other species. Surf clams and ocean quahogs has an even smaller list of measures that can be modified through a framework, and the council agreed that no measures can be modified through a framework for chub mackerel. So what the heck is up with chub mackerel? Why is it different than the others? So this is something that the council agreed to through the development of Amendment 21, which added chub mackerel to the mackerel squid butterfish FMP. The council took final action on that amendment in 2019. During development of that action, there was a lot of discussion about trade-offs for things such as human use of chub mackerel compared to their role in the ecosystem. But as I said before, chub mackerel is a very data-limited species, so there's limited quantitative information available to assess these sorts of trade-offs. So given that, the council agreed to always use amendments rather than frameworks for chub mackerel to ensure a more thorough process with more opportunities for public input than a framework. So an important caveat to keep in mind in all cases related to frameworks is that just because something is on the framework list does not guarantee that it can be modified through a framework or prevent the use of an amendment. So amendments can still be required for things that are significant departures from previously contemplated measures, new concepts, or controversial changes, even if they're on the list of framework measures. The decision of whether something is a framework or an amendment is always decided on a case-by-case basis, and the council works with GARFO to help figure out what is required or most appropriate. And the council is never required to do a framework instead of an amendment. If a council wants to elevate something to an amendment, the council always has that option. So if we, the topic here is the multi-year specifications, frequencies, the process the council will use in spec setting and review years. These are the types of changes that would not really be expected to be controversial, would not be expected to meaningfully impact how the fisheries operate and therefore how the fisheries impact the environment. They would not be expected to require complex analysis and would be considered largely administrative in nature. However, if the council wants to consider changes like this in a way that they can apply across all FMPs, the council would need to do this through an amendment because of how the current framework lists are described, especially for chub mackerel. So if you have to do an amendment anyway, maybe this is a good opportunity to expand the list of measures which can be modified through a framework action to help provide more flexibility in the future. So for example, the current list of measures which can potentially be modified through a framework for all the other species in the MSB FMP does include that language along the lines of any other management measures currently included in the FMPs. So if the current mackerel, squid, butterfish list also applied to chub mackerel, then that would provide consistency across all species in the FMP. And perhaps the council might want to consider also adding that language about any other management measures currently included in the FMP to the framework list for golden and blue line tilefish, surf clams, and ocean quahogs to provide more flexibility there. But again, remember that slide that I showed earlier with the caveat that all the time, just because something is on the framework list doesn't mean it's guaranteed that you can still do a framework. Amendments can still be required for new concepts, significant departures from previously contemplated measures, and controversial changes, and the council can still choose or be required to use an amendment instead of a framework. So given all that, the staff recommendation is to initiate an omnibus FMP amendment to consider 3 topics. The first of which is to consider potential revisions to the maximum duration of the multi-year specifications across FMPs with the goals of increasing consistency across FMPs, increasing efficiency in the specifications process, and improving alignment between science and management timelines. The next topic is to clarify the meetings and documentation required each year with the goals of updating outdated FMP and regulation text and allowing the council the flexibility to choose the timing and content of relevant meetings and documentations for each spec cycle. And then lastly, consider expanding the list of framework measures for the species that currently have those more restrictive lists to help provide improved consistency across FMPs and increased efficiency of the management process. So if the council initiates a management action to consider those sorts of topics, then we will need to have further coordination with management partners, which we haven't done really any of that at all yet, because again, the tasking was just for a white paper and there's no management action that you've actually initiated yet. So if you initiate a management action, then staff will work more with GARFO to talk through things like the policy implications and what sort of analysis and documentation will be needed for NEPA compliance. We'll work with the Commission and the New England Council for any coordination that would be necessary on jointly managed FNPs. And then the timeline for completion of a management action will depend on the complexity of the alternatives under consideration and other priorities. But those would be future discussions to have if you initiate a management action. And again, that's the objective of your discussion right now, is to consider, do you want to initiate an omnibus FMP amendment to consider those types of changes that were suggested. And if so, then we will have discussions at future council meetings about refining the alternatives and talking about the timeline and things like that. So that's all I had, and we're happy to take questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I'll look around the table for questions. Sorry, Anna. Go ahead.
Thanks. And this might be a question for some of the charter folks, but I remember when we were having the discussion about sector separation, one idea that was tossed out was separating the timing for spec setting of the rec measures from the for hire measures as a way of adding some flexibility to the for hire fleet, and giving them slightly more time to adjust to any changes, which would give them some stability and some ability to plan. Is that something that, does anybody else remember that conversation? Is that something that we could consider within this if we moved it forward? And Mike was nodding his head.
Yeah, well, I'll see if staff has, or if not, I can go to, Mike, you want to try that first?
Well, I was just nodding my head that I remember.
You remember, yeah,
I
that's kind of
remember
what
the
I thought.
conversation.
Okay, so we'll see if staff has any comments on that.
I don't remember that conversation. I may not have been listening to it, but I think the intent here was just the timing of things like ABCs, ACLs, RHLs, and then the specific rec measures that go along with that could potentially happen on a different timeline. I mean, every time we get an updated RHL, I think there's the intent that we revisit the recreational measures that go along with that. But this wasn't really my thinking of it anyway, is that this is kind of at the level of like our flow chart of like OFL down to RHL. And then the rec measures is like where you take it from there, which I was envisioning as separate, but I don't know that anything in this would necessarily need to constrain those timelines. I think there could still be flexibility to have the measures set on whatever timeline is most appropriate. That's just my initial take on it. I'm not sure if anybody else wants to weigh in there.
Yeah, we will. I'll turn it over to Chris for a second.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Anna, you know this, we're still working on that rec sector separation amendment. And we, I think, are now looking at a workshop in early 2027. So there's going to be ongoing discussions about the amendment from now until then. Certainly the topic that you just brought up could be introduced again and see what folks think about it. So I think that would be the appropriate way to deal with it.
Okay, other hands, Joe Grist.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was about to follow up with Chris because I know it's in our implementation plan. I was going back and double checking it. And I am correct with the multi-year spec setting. That is also part of our action plan for EO 14276, correct, that Julie's talking about. So that we've laid out the groundwork for what she's done in the white paper. You checked the box on the implementation plan now, so nice job. But that is also part of our response to 14276. Okay.
Yep, follow up.
Yeah, correct. Excuse me. So the other thing, now that you've brought it up, Jill, if you go to the slide about implementation or next steps, I can't remember how you titled it, Julia. Yeah, that one. So the way that we're looking at this, and depending upon the action that the council takes today, if you decide collectively to initiate an action and you want to proceed with an amendment, realize that that amendment's not going to get done this year. We don't have, and similar to the point that Michelle, or the conversation that Michelle and I had earlier on another topic, it's not part of the 2026 implementation plan. We've checked the box, we've done the white paper, we presented a lot of information. Now you can act on it. If you act on it, it's likely that we'll be able to do a lot of the coordination this year in Julia's spare time and Brandon's spare time, but we're not going to really do much beyond that. So this would be a 2027 implementation plan thing, if you want to think about it that way, the actual amendment development. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Joe. I appreciate that. That helped. Yeah, I think if there aren't any further questions, it may be helpful to start with a motion. We have a staff recommendation on one way forward. Okay, Joe, if you want to give that a shot, I appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah, glad to read it in. Move to initiate an omnibus FMP amendment to consider the following topics: revisions to the multi-year specification frequencies, clarification on the meetings and documentation required each year to support the specifications process, and expand the list of measures which can be modified through a framework adjustment for chub mackerel, surf clams, ocean cogs, golden tallfish, and blue line tallfish.
Okay, thank you. We have a motion made and second by Mike Luisi. Okay, Joe, do you want to speak to it a little bit, or?
Just to make note, staff did a good job covering this item. It is part of the implementation plan. I mean, this is all covered. Everything we've laid out is led us to today in this motion. So I think that speaks for itself.
Okay, do we have a point of clarification Mike, before I go to the seconder? Okay, Mike, anything to add?
Yeah, quickly, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, this morning's agenda has been about process and trying to make ourselves better in how we operate as a council, in our coordination with our partners. And I appreciate the work that staff put into thinking about this, and I'm comfortable with the amendment process as long as it takes to consider how we're going to make ourselves better in our process. So I support it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Mike Pentney?
Yeah, thanks. Just to the maker and seconder of the motion, maybe suggesting a friendly to add a fourth bullet, something like and other measures to improve efficiency. And the reason I say that is a couple things that we've been talking about that might work towards the goal of this action. Talked about chub mackerel, but we still have to publish annual specifications for chub mackerel. Well, that might be an example where instead of having to publish the specifications, we put the quota in the regs, and then we only change it if we got new information that we, should change it. We've talked for a number of years about flipping the surf clam minimum size provision, which is the default is that there is a minimum size. And every year we have to do the analysis and publish that we're waiving the minimum size. Well, we could switch that and say that there is no minimum size unless we do the analysis and determine that it's required. And so I think that's just two examples of things that we could do that would provide some stability to the industry and alleviate some of the regulatory burden on the council and the agency.
Well, thank you, Mike. The timing of that is good. So to the maker and the seconder, I would ask, are we okay adding the and other measures to improve efficiency to the motion?
No, I appreciate the comments from the RA, and definitely I agree.
And I'm getting a head nod from the seconder as well. Okay, so we have a motion before us. Discussion on the motion from council. Not seeing any further discussion. I will ask. Okay. Okay. Any comments from the public, either in the room or online, specifically to the motion? I'm not seeing any hands in the back of the room. It looks like we have one hand online. That would be Jeff Kalin. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Everybody, sorry I couldn't be there today. I'm Jeff Kalin with Lunch Fisheries, and I just want to make a comment on the chub mackerel discussion and portion of this motion, if I could. I was a council member in 2013 when the council added chub to the mackerel squid butterfish FMP. So I had lost track of the fact that you can't change the chub quota unless you had an amendment, unless there was an amendment. So I'm speaking in support of this motion, working to allow the chub mackerel specifications to be changed without an amendment, using this as the amendment to make that change, I guess, because The chub mackerel are still around. It's another opportunity for fishermen. We talked a lot, you all talked a lot during the scup discussion about the mix of species and so forth. So we've been thinking and would like to ask the council during the next specs round for mackerel, squid, butterfish to ask the SSC for their expert judgment about moving that 5 million up, since this is a fish that exists in the Atlantic all the way to Peru. So I like this for that reason. I don't want to, all due respect to the RA, Mike, I don't want to see it in statute because or regulation rather, because we hope that we can increase it. Go back to the SSC and make that argument. So I'm in support of the motion. In New England, we've seen the herring assessment go to 5 years where it was 3, and we had a lot of problems as the industry did on this same issue at that council. So a little trepidation about the result of the efficiencies in putting specifications in place for multiple number of years without change. But at any rate, I'm speaking in support of the motion, and I just wanted to flag our interest in considering a larger chub mackerel quota in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Jeff. Follow up or comment, Mike Penny?
Yeah, thanks. Just to my intent, which Jeff Kalin just reacted to, I was not suggesting that we would not have the ability to change the chub mackerel quota. I was just suggesting that we could make a change through this action so that we wouldn't have to do a regulatory action to not change the quota, which we currently do every year. If there was, as Jeff has suggested, the ability to change the chub mackerel quota through a framework adjustment, then we would do that rulemaking, and that would change the quota. But then in the intervening years where we're not changing the chub mackerel quota and we're leaving it status quo for some period of time, we wouldn't have to do an annual regulatory process in those years. So that was my intent, not to forestall a potential increase in the chub mackerel quota.
Thank you, Mike. That helps. That's very helpful. I support the logic in what you were saying, and I'm glad that I made the point that perhaps we could get to the point where we could change the chub quota through a framework in the future as a result of this moving ahead, even though it might not happen until 2027. So again, thanks for the time. That's all I've got.
Okay, thank you. I don't see other hands from the public. I'll bring it back to the table. I think one thing that I would like to just have on the record again is, as Chris pointed out, that if this amendment is started, that we're talking about 2027 for that process. So as long as that's on the record. Any further discussion from council members? Okay, not seeing any. I'll ask the question. Is there any objection to the motion to initiate the omnibus FMP amendment? Any abstentions? Not seeing anything, so we can consider that motion approved by consent. Tony Krantz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question for the RA regarding specifications, and I'm not going to be here tomorrow during his report, and I can't be online for it either. So I'm hoping to be able to indulge some time. I recognize we're running a little late, but I think it's something that's very important, and I know there are some board members online as well, and it relates to the percent change approach framework, and I think it's addendum 25 or 26 on our end. We have not seen a proposed rule for that document yet. And I think it has some significant implications for the 2026 recreational fishery. And so I'm hoping that Mike can talk us through what those implications are, what it means for federal waters permit holders versus state water permit holders in terms of what recreational measures will be in place for summer flounder scup and black sea bass? And at what point in time would we think that there might be a proposed rule for that framework so that those rec specs that we're hoping to put in place through the state conservation equivalency measures might be seen? Because I'm worried that we're not going to have those at this point in time.
Okay, well, thank you for the question, Tony. I know, as you said, there wasn't a very good place to pigeonhole this important question, so we'll give it a shot now, Mike, if you're willing to try and tackle that.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thanks, Tony. It was something that I was going to raise tomorrow during my report, so I'm glad you raised it so that you can be here. And it is an important thing, and I wanted everybody to be aware that this is a very challenging circumstance. So just to remind everybody, recreational fishing measures that apply in federal waters for summer flounder, black sea bass, and black sea bass have the conservation equivalency process, which allows us, when conservation equivalency is approved, following an action by the commission and recommendations from the council and the board, to waive federal coastwide measures for federally permitted for-hire vessels wherever they're fishing, and private anglers when fishing in federal waters. And unless and until conservation equivalency is approved each year, the coastwide measures, federal measures, are what apply in federal waters. So as of today, April 8th, the coastwide measures are in effect in federal waters for summer flounder and sea bass. In a normal year, we would have a proposed rule on the street already to recommend approving the council's recommendation and the board's recommendation for conservation equivalency. And we would be awaiting the letter from Tony approving the suite of measures submitted by the states. And then we would, in our final rule, be able to approve conservation equivalency and waive the federal coastwide measures. As Tony noted, this year, because of the harvest control rule 2.0, the rec measure setting process, whatever you want to call it, that was submitted last year, that changed the process by which the council and the board develop the recommendations for conservation equivalency and the basis for those recommendations. Because we have not yet proposed that action, we have no ability to propose the council's recommendation for 2026 to approve conservation equivalency, because the council and the board's recommendation that was made in December was sort of predicated and depended upon the prior action. So we're waiting for a proposed rule on that sort of precursor action. Once we have a proposed rule for that action, I feel we could publish the proposed rule for the 2026 conservation equivalency. Note that it would be contingent on final approval of the harvest control rule, final rule. And then once that rule is finalized, we could then finalize the rec measures for 2026. So the bottom line is, at this point in time, we cannot approve conservation equivalency for 2026. And we won't be able to do that unless and until the proposed rule for the prior action, the harvest control rule action, publishes and is finalized. So, we are very late in the season to be having this conversation. And certainly when we were meeting back in February, I had presumed and hoped that by now we would have everything in place and the rules for the harvest control rule would have published and we'd have a proposed rule on the street, or at least well in hand for the rec measures. But here we are, it's middle of April and we don't have those rules in place. So everybody should be aware that there's a very strong possibility that the federal coastwide measures will be in effect for potentially a good part, if not the entire of summer.
Follow up, Tony?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mike, for that information. And based on what Mike has told us, I'm going to make a recommendation to the board chair as well as the commission chair to send letters over to headquarters to see what is going on with that proposed rule. I'm hoping maybe the council may also send a letter, and we would encourage the states to also send letters, I think would be most beneficial so that these fisheries can see the measures that the board and council had intended.
Yeah, thanks again. And, important discussion. I don't know if, we'll look to get into it any more tomorrow if needed, but I guess, to the states, as a state director, I would say I also agree with Tony. If there is, anything that can be put forward in time to just get a better understanding of when this may happen for us, I think that's important. And I would just ask, to perhaps the will of the council, the notion that if the council is interested in sending a letter, I'd entertain it. Mr. Luisi, did you have a hand up?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I won't belabor the point. Maybe we can talk over lunch or another time. But yesterday morning, I just signed off on our new black sea bass regulations for this year. So does that mean if conservation equivalency is not enacted, that if someone from Maryland leaves Ocean City and goes into federal waters, they're going to have to comply with there won't be a federal waters fishery that would mirror the seasons in Maryland as it happens when the conservation equivalency is accepted?
So for state-only permitted vessels, whatever the states do, obviously, is what's in place in state waters. For federal permit holders, federal for-hire permit holders, then they are subject as a condition of the permit to the more restrictive of the two. So if they're fishing in state waters and the federal coastwide measures, and again, these are the 2025 federal coastwide measures, not the ones that we selected in December. If those are more restrictive than your state measures, they'd be subject to the coastwide federal measures, even in state waters, if they have that federal permit. If they're then fishing in federal waters, obviously they're subject to the federal measures, unless the state measures are more restrictive, in which case they're subject to those. So that's the crux of the issue.
Yeah, and I could just speak, for New Jersey. Well, I think that each state may have it spelled out a little differently on permit holders, and if some states have regulations that require to participate in that fishery that you have a federal permit. So there isn't even an option of just being state. Joe Grist, you had your hand up as well.
I think just for the benefit of all in public and everything, can we restate what the current federal rule is for black sea bass? It's just to have it on the record, what we're talking about here exactly.
Yeah, Joe, let's see if we can give Mike some time for that.
I looked it up while you were talking.
Okay.
So if the 2025 non-preferred coastwide measures are what we're 2025 non-preferred coastwide would be 15 inches, 5 fish, May 15th through September 8th. And it, depends on the state. Like some states that's a lot worse than what they have right now. Some states it's better. Well, I'll just.
All right, I appreciate that.
Yeah, I don't have the summer flounder one ready to go. Sorry about that.
That's okay. I think this might be, well.
It applies to both.
Yes. No, I was just thinking.
For the record, just so everyone knows what we're talking about flounder too, right?
That's fair, Joe. Sure. Yeah, if we can get that, yeah, I'd be happy to take that. All right, so if we can get that, or we will get that, Joe, we'll, if not right now. Mike?
Yeah, so I might be wrong. So I got a minimum size of 18.5 inches for fluke. a season of May 8th to September 30th, and a bag, I think, of three fish. I'd like to verify that because I was just doing it on the fly.
That matches what we just looked up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if anything changes, as I mentioned, this was something that, well, as was mentioned, this is something that the RA had intended to bring up. If we do need to have further discussion on that again tomorrow, I think we could do that. So I guess we are all officially on notice. I don't know if any council members, if there's anything else to follow up on. This isn't something I'm necessarily looking to go to the public on right now. Apologies, Mike Wayne. Like I said, this is a potential item for tomorrow, Mike, if you're able to make that. But you could also message me offline if you have specific questions. I'll get to you. I apologize. So with that news, maybe we need a we need a solid lunch break here. I do want to give us an hour. So we are running a little bit late, but again, I think we have some time today. Our agenda is going until 5. So let's take a lunch break. I'm going to turn it over to Chris Moore first. But Chris, what do you think? We can go to 1:30. We'll give it a full hour. We'll go to 1:30, and Chris has an announcement for us.
So speaking of food, no food in this room. So you go out to lunch, you find a great place, you want to bring it back to the hotel, eat it outside in the hallway or downstairs. Anybody that brings food in here, we automatically get billed hundreds of dollars for whatever reason. So don't bring food into the room. Secondly, the beverage service will end today at 2 o'clock. So when you get back from lunch, grab a drink or drinks, as many drinks as you want, because that's going to go away at 2 o'clock. Okay? Thanks. No, candy? No, we take care of the candy. I'm just talking about the drinks.
Okay, so we will adjourn until 1:30. We'll pick it up with reptile fish. And Stephen, if you can post that for us, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.